Hello everyone and welcome to the complete Gaming Creepypasta Iceberg Explained. This iceberg is almost 3 hours long and has every gaming creepypasta we have covered and more. This has been an amazing journey getting to make this iceberg alongside this great community. So thank you all for your recommendations and contributions. Now without further ado, let's start this iceberg off right by starting from the top. Sonic.exe is the story about a haunted copy of Sonic the Hedgehog. The story begins with a man receiving a game from a friend in the mail. The disc that he had received came with a warning about the game. The note told him that he must destroy the game, that an evil entity was tied to it, and that he wasn't strong enough to defend himself from it. The man notices the disc has Sonic.exe written on it in black marker. He weighs his options, but ultimately decides to ignore his friend's wishes and puts the disc in his computer. After installing and booting the .exe file, the narrator sees the familiar Sonic the Hedgehog title screen appear. A split second after pressing the start button, the screen changed from the usual happy Sonic to a demonic version of the character. Sonic had black eyes with red pupils in the center, and they were bleeding. The water in the background was now blood red and the sky had gone black. In the bottom right corner, he saw Sega 666. This screen flashed for a second before it loaded into the character select screen from Sonic 3. Tails, Knuckles, and Dr. Robotnik were all selectable, which the narrator noted as strange since Robotnik was typically the main villain of the game and hadn't been playable at this point in time. The narrator selected Tails and loaded it into the first level. The level's title was wrong and it was called Hill Act 1. The first 5 minutes of the game was just a barren level, almost like it was incomplete. The music was playing backwards and started to get lower as Tails traveled around. Eventually Tails would come upon the corpses of the animals that he and Sonic were supposed to save. They were all mutilated in gruesome ways. The bodies continued to stack up as Tails kept moving to the right. Tails then found Sonic, who was just standing there with his eyes closed. Tails approached Sonic slowly as Sonic continued to ignore him. As soon as Tails was close enough to almost touch Sonic, static began to cover the screen. Sonic opened his eyes and revealed the same red dots from the opening screen. A message flashed across the screen reading, "Hello, do you want to play with me?" The author talked about how creepy this all was, but continued to play anyway. What followed was the evil version of Sonic chasing Tails until he supposedly kills him as the screen turns to black. The next few levels are the same thing as the first. Knuckles runs from Sonic but isn't fast enough to escape him. Dr. Robotnik is the last character to be killed by this evil Sonic. Once Sonic has finished killing off all the characters available in the game, an image would pop up on the screen with a demonic picture of him. Underneath the image were the words, "I am God." Creepypasta ends with the narrator finding a creepy Sonic plush sitting on his bed with bloodstains under his eyes. Sonic.exe would even go on to inspire fan art, a total recreation fan game, and even its own community, totally in love with this evil rendition of Sonic. Sunny the Treaded Clown is a creepypasta about a kid who loves to torture his Sims. He specifically creates Sims just to be killed. Some were based off of people he knew, and some based off famous evil individuals. In the original Sims, if you got your Sims moodlets down low enough, a clown named Sunny would eventually come to your Sims' lot and try to make them feel better. More often than not, he would just walk around sadly and not help out at all. Sunny came to the lot, and the author immediately started to torture him as well. He was ruining his day and making him more and more sad. He was explaining how fun it was to mess with his Sims. Eventually the narrator decides to kill off his Sims by starting a fire. He put a lit firework in the house and started the fire with his Sims inside, including Sunny. This leads to the familiar sound that plays when a fire starts in The Sims. A few of his Sims caught fire, and instead of their usual sounds of pain and flailing, they seemed more realistic. They moved more like a person would instead of how a Sim normally would when they were on fire. While the Sims were screaming in pain, they all looked up at the author. He was shocked by their pained expressions on their faces. They all looked at him like they knew that he was the one who set them on fire. When Sunny looked at the author, he had an evil grin on his face. He laughed in a way similar to the Joker and wailed while on fire. It was a horrifying image that scared the author. The PC that the author was playing on shut off. He reset the computer and there were visual issues when he started up The Sims. The game looked different and the sound was completely mute. More creepy stuff ensues. The creepy paintings in the game keep looking at the author. The TV keeps changing to the horror channel, and the author keeps receiving creepy messages from Sonny the Clown. Sonny the Clown would eventually steal a kid, like a burglar in the game would. The kid Sims would scream and cry in an overly realistic way. Sonny would return and continue until the family was entirely gone. The creepypasta ends with all the homes in the game being erased from the world, leaving just a graveyard where the author used to torture his Sims. He had since dropped the game forever and now has a deep-rooted fear of clowns. Ben Drowned is the story of a haunted Nintendo 64 cartridge. The game was purchased by the author of the story and follows his descent into madness. The author purchased the game while away at college. He wanted more games for his Nintendo 64 and figured he could find some at a yard sale. After searching for a few in his area, he decided to check out some over the weekend. The author found a few games for a good price, but not the game he specifically went out to find. That wasn't until he came upon a man standing in his lawn. The elder man wore a crooked grin and had a table with paintings on it, clearly trying to sell them at his yard sale. The author walked over and inquired about if he had any video games. The man paused for a moment before retreating into his home. While he was inside, the author looked through his paintings and noticed that one looked like Majora's Mask, the game he was really hoping to find today. The man returns with an old-looking gray N64 cartridge. The cartridge had Majora written on it in black permanent marker. It was the exact game that he had been looking for, and he was excited even if it wasn't in the best shape. The old man gave him the game for free and he took it home, too excited to play it. Popping the game into his console, the first thing he noticed was that the old save file was still on the cartridge. The file was named Ben, and the author thought it must have been the old man's grandson or something. He ignored the file and started a new one named Link underneath it. Strange things began to happen in the game. The townies would all call him Link, but every once in a while they would call him Ben instead. Which was odd, and it must have been a glitch, he thought. The author went back to the main menu and deleted the first file named Ben, thinking that would fix the weird glitch issue, but it didn't. Now the townies would call him nothing. It was a blank space where his name should be. After the author tried to do the fourth day glitch, a popular glitch in Majora's Mask, strange things began to happen. The main town was now in a Twilight Zone version of itself. The town was empty and the music was playing backwards. The occasional laugh of the mask salesman would play very low in the background, adding to the ominous feeling. Link grabbed his neck and the screen flashed for a moment with a picture of the happy mask salesman. A few seconds later, a creepy Link statue appeared and began to follow the author. Every time he would move, the statue would follow him. The screen faded and the author was now on top of the clock tower with the Skull Kid. The author fired a few arrows at the Skull Kid before he said, "That won't do you any good," before Link was lifted into the air and burst into flames. What follows is the author's descent into madness. He keeps seeing the happy mask salesman everywhere and the famous lines, "You've met with a terrible fate, haven't you?" and "You shouldn't have done that," are repeated over and over again in his head. The save select screen has changed to Ben Drowned and then would eventually change to Your Turn. The author couldn't sleep as his nightmares were filled with the face of the creepy Link statue. It followed him in the game and now followed him in his dreams. He accepted that this was the ghost of Ben haunting him. Ben was a young boy from the neighborhood where the author had bought the game. He had drowned, as the game had suggested, and now he was haunting the Majora's Mask game cartridge as it was his favorite game. The author talks about how he'd used Cleverbot to ask if Ben had drowned. He would post the weird and cryptic conversations he had with the bot. Some of the conversations confirmed what he had already knew about Ben, and eventually Cleverbot would claim to be Ben, and that he now haunted his computer. The first arc of the story ends with the author explaining how he had sealed away the computer with Ben on it, and he hoped that the entity would never be able to haunt someone ever again. There are 2 more arcs to the full story, and I think I'll talk about those in a separate video all to itself. Herobrine tells of an encounter that a Minecraft player had while playing in his solo world. The author was playing Minecraft alone, but due to having a not very powerful PC, had to play the game on a very low draw distance. This meant that the further away anything was from the author would appear to be in a fog. essentially making the world a little more creepy. While the author was roaming around the world, he saw another character just outside of the fog. He tried to follow him, but every time he got close, the figure would move just outside of his draw distance. When he finally did see the other character, he looked just like the default character Steve, but with white, pupilless eyes. The figure was gone as quickly as he saw it. As the author continued with the game, he began to notice tunnels were built in his world while he wasn't playing it. Strange structures kept popping up everywhere, and trees had all their leaves removed. The entity would appear just out of the corner of the author's eye, but always just out of sight when he turned to look at him. He tried to turn up the draw distance, but nothing seemed to work. Finally, the author went to the forums to try and figure out if this was happening to anyone else. The post would get deleted time and time again. Eventually, they would receive a PM from an account called Herobrine that simply said, "Stop." Herobrine would become the boogeyman of Minecraft back at the beginning of the game's life. In the early days of Minecraft, everything seemed so mysterious, and it almost seemed possible that a character could exist just to haunt the player. Tails Doll is an evil entity that exists inside the Sonic R video game. He is an unlockable character that you can only get after completing the game to 100%. Once unlocked, you'll see a strange and eerie looking doll version of Tails. It is said that the Tails doll from the game can curse anyone who plays the game. If you meet certain requirements, then the Tails doll will be able to leave the game and haunt you. Of course, the first requirement is to complete the game and unlock him. Once you've done that, you'll need to play the tag game mode. You must select the Tails doll and then start the mode. Once started, you'll need to tag Supersonic. Once all of these criteria have been met, the Tails doll will appear on your screen. He will look menacing and possessed. The song "Can You Feel the Sunshine" will be playing in the background. The Tails doll is now haunting you. You will see him in your dreams, and you may hear him come knocking on your door. In the year of 1996, there was a strange surge in illnesses and suicides in children in Japan shortly after the release of Pokémon Red and Green. The deaths were related to an area in the game known as Lavender Town. Due to this, the incident was labeled as Lavender Town Syndrome. Lavender Town is a town in Red and Green that has the only known Pokémon graveyard in the series. The town is far more creepy than any other area in the game. This has led to many asking about its inclusion in a kid's game at all. The Lavender Town Syndrome actually has to do with the music in the game. It's this eerie song that drives home the feeling that the town may have some dark secrets hiding beneath its surface. The song was said to be composed of binaural beats, or two tones that when combined can make an audio-optical illusion. The original Lavender Town music had these beats, but the later entries and re-releases removed them entirely. The reason listed was because it gave listeners headaches, nausea, and according to Lavender Town Syndrome, suicidal tendencies, especially in children. Later, someone ran the Lavender Town theme through a special software, and near the end of the song noticed that some unknown had spelled out something. Unknown are Pokemon that are shaped like letters. They wouldn't be introduced until the following game. The unknown spelled out, "Leave now." Lavender Town would become a very popular spot for Pokemon creepypastas and urban legends. Mario is a creepypasta about a Super Mario World hack the author downloads from a popular hacking website. The game is described as being a Mario hack that starts out pretty normally, except for the messages in the game being very different. One of them reads that Mario is the villain and he has kidnapped the princess instead of the usual Bowser. This whole story makes Mario out to be the bad guy. It even has Yoshi talking about how Mario has trapped him in the egg that he was currently in. The pointed advice block even says, "I hate you." The other advice blocks had different messages written in them as well. Some stated things like, "But is there anything I can do to change your mind?" Another says, "This is the selfish way out." A message later in the story would say, "Don't you think you've done enough?" The author completes the first boss level and gets a disturbing message afterwards. This leads the author to the final part of the hack, where he is on a long road where he can only walk to the right. The author ends up in a world with a black background and small doors that he can't enter. Going right, the author ends up in an area where he can only jump off of a ledge and into a pit. Jumping into the pit, the author finds a pipe. The game ends there with the idea that Mario had died as the game had crashed. The story then picks up when the author found a file in the game's folder that he didn't know what to do with before. He changes the file from a text file into an image file, and this was shown on the screen with the caption of, "Find me."
Cursed copies of video games are a rather popular idea amongst creepypastas. Lost Silver is one such creepypasta. Around the time that Soul Silver came out, the author was feeling nostalgic for the original game, so he bought a copy from GameStop. When he booted up, the Game Freak logo was glitched, and he was immediately loaded into the game's previous file, which he noted as weird as he was expecting the cart to be wiped. The file had 999.99 hours put into it, with all 16 badges, 999,909 Pokemon dollars, and all 251 Pokemon, including Mew Two and Celebi. The author figured he probably used the Game Shark to get them. Deciding to check his Pokemon, he was surprised to find 5 unknowns that spelled out Leave, and a Cyndaquil named Hurry, that only knew Leer and Flash. Closing the menu, he found himself in a room at Bellsprout Tower. Walking around for a few minutes, he couldn't seem to find his way out. Eventually, he managed to find a ladder. Going up the ladder, he found himself in a pitch black room. Remembering that his Cyndaquil had flashed, he used it to light up the room, which he immediately regretted, as the room was a chilling red, with a linear gray path heading south. Heading in that direction, the room got progressively darker. Hitting the end of the path, he found a sign that said, "Turn back now." The option yes or no popped up on the screen. Not knowing what to do, the author hit yes. The text "Hurry has fainted" appeared on the screen, and his Cyndaquil was replaced with another unknown. They now spelled out "He died." Closing his Pokemon status menu, the pitch black room was now revealed to him. It was a small room, only being 4 gray squares. Checking his trainer profile, Gold was now missing his arms. The expression was more sad than smug now. He also appeared to have 24 badges. After a few minutes, the rope escape sound played once again, and he was transported once again, this time to Sprout Tower. The sprite of Gold had also once more changed. He was now missing his legs, and his skin was pure white. Pokemon consisted of 5 level 15 unknowns that spelled out "Dying," and a Celebi that only knew one move called Perish Song. Heading north, he passed some generic NPCs that he was unable to talk to. They were also pure white, just like him. Eventually, he found a transparent red. Approaching him, he was pulled into a Pokemon battle. Gold's back sprite matched his front sprite, with the bloody eyes and white skin and missing arms. Red's sprite was basically the same as the original game, the only difference being he was transparent now, and appeared to be crying. Both of them only had one Pokemon. The author's unknown seemed to have disappeared. When the battle began, he was only given the option to attack. With only one move available to him, he used Perish Song, which gave them 3 turns before both Pokemon fainted. But weirdly enough, after 3 turns, only Celebi fainted, though the battle didn't count as a loss. On his turn, Pikachu used Destiny Bond, with the text "Pikachu has died" appearing before he was awarded the victory. Red's sprite showed back up before he was beheaded. Back on the overworld map, Gold's sprite had yet again changed, taking the same transparency that Red had. Checking his profile yet again, all that remained of Gold was his head. With 40 badges now, and level 20 unknowns, now spelling "no more," transporting once more, it appeared that he was now back in his room in New Bark Town. Unable to interact with anything in the room, he decided to leave through the southern door, but to his surprise, he just passed right through it, straight into a black void. Going south, he eventually reached a white area, and Gold's sprite turned black and transparent. During his journey south, he finally encountered something. It was the regular Gold sprite. Talking to him, he said, "Goodbye forever." The text "?" Nightmare appeared, and for the final time, the rope escape sound went off, and he was pulled downward, back into the small room from before. His sprite was now completely gone, and he now had 0 badges. The unknown's now spelling "I'm dead." Going back to the overworld, the room was then covered by the same gray blocks as the walls, which spelled out "RIP." The room was a grave. Gold had been dead the entire time. Presumably, his death occurred a few years after his victory over Red. Gold was a young trainer, and despite his success, couldn't escape the inevitable fate of death, and was eventually forgotten by the next generation. The author was unable to get the game to work after that, trying a few times to reset it before giving up.
Sally.exe is the unofficial sequel to Sonic.exe that follows a similar formula. The author finds a copy of sonic.exe on eBay and is upset that he never had the option to buy the show in his region, as they never released the DVDs where he lived, so he couldn't let this opportunity pass him up. He ordered the DVD and it showed up the next day. When he put it into his laptop, he noticed that the DVD didn't work, but instead just opened the files that were located on the disc. In the folder was a file called Sally.exe. This confused the author, but he clicked on the exe file anyways. It played one episode of the show, the episode where Sonic and Sally kiss. It was an odd episode choice, but he was surprised that the file contained only one episode when it claimed to be the whole series. Eventually, the author gets bored and downloads a Sonic game from the internet. Starting it up, he notices that the usual Sega sound at the beginning has been slowed down to almost sound demonic. The game started with Amy Rose, a character that never appeared in the Sega Genesis Sonic games. The title screen appeared and Tails and Knuckles were X'd out already. The game let the author play as either Amy, who had holes all over her body, or Cream. After Amy and Cream had gruesome deaths, next came Sally. Sally was the author's favorite character and he couldn't imagine anything bad happening to her. He started the level anyway. Selecting her level, he was met with the demonic Sonic from sonic.exe. The corners of the screen began to close in on Sally before they crushed her to death. Sally later appeared on screen with her eyes stitched shut. The author noticed something on the corner of his bed. It was a Sally plushie, but with her eyes also sewn shut. Misfortune is an obscure and lost Game Boy game. No physical copies of the game exist and no one has found a ROM. What people do know of the game come from personal accounts of the game and some screenshots. Of the people who have played it, they consider it to be one of the scariest games they've ever played. In the game, the player plays a young boy trapped inside of a gothic building. After searching the building for a while, the player will come upon an entity. He claims to be an all-knowing being that exists within every fabric of reality. The being then poses a question. Do you want to challenge me? Answering yes will start the maze portion of the game. The player must make their way through the many mazes in the game. One of the more popular ones is a maze where you must make your way through 4 cabins. The text box before any of the trials in the game will say, choose wrong and misfortune will befall your loved ones. Choosing the wrong one, failing a riddle, or just making a mistake in the game will lead you to the game over screen. A more detailed model of the entity in the game will appear on the screen with the words in the text box saying, I am God here. The side effects of the game were reported heavily in the late 90s. Players reported feeling depressed and a feeling of dread after seeing the game over screen. The players that reported this in the forums would sometimes go inactive altogether after posting. If you were to look for the game, you would most likely not be able to find it. The game is actually said to be hidden inside other popular Game Boy games. You can find the game hidden in some games like Legend of Zelda, Link's Awakening, Pokémon Red, and Spud's Adventure. Finding the original game is almost impossible at this point. If you do find it, the game comes with a warning. You may experience the best horror game of your life, but you will also experience the misfortune that comes with it. NES Godzilla tells the story of a man who felt nostalgic for his old favorite video game from his childhood. He bought an NES but couldn't find the game anywhere. That was until his friend found a copy for him. The author was so excited to finally get to relive that part of his childhood and finally finish the game he wasn't able to so many years ago. The author starts the game and feels a wave of nostalgia seeing the game again after so many years. After the author gets to the first boss in the game, it glitches with red blocks appearing everywhere. The author removed the cartridge, blew into it, and then put it back into the console. After completing the area where the game had glitched, he discovered a new boss was in the game, one that hadn't been in the game originally. The author thought the game might have been a prototype version of the original. He moved as fast as possible to encounter the new enemy type. Once he got there, he had to complete a different boss first. Upon defeating him again, instead of the usual defeat animation, he instead began to almost be devoured by the same glitch as before. A similar glitch would happen with his next boss fight. He defeated the enemy and his sprite seemed to break off in fragments, almost like he was a piece of glass. This all happened before he made it to the newly implemented boss encounter. He beat that boss pretty quickly and took over the enemy base with no issues. The author started the second map and made it all the way through pretty easily. He noticed the new monsters on this map as well and made his way towards it for another fight. After fighting a different monster than the one he was expecting to, he saw a new icon on the map that he'd never seen before. The author started the level, and as soon as he did, he saw a hellish looking world with no sky and flames burning in the background. The only background music was a low drum that almost sounded like a heartbeat. At the top of the screen was one word, run, which confused the author as he wasn't sure what he was supposed to be running from. After noticing Godzilla was taking damage but not seeing from where, he restarted the game. The author went to the password screen and jumped back to where he was previously. He started the same level, and this time he saw it. There was this red creature that he's never seen in any Godzilla movie before, right behind him, chasing Godzilla. He began to run as he heard the creature's low bellow. This red creature had spider-like legs and long appendages. It was terrifying for the author, but he soon escaped, narrowly at that. He stared at the screen for a while, but decided he would still continue playing the game. The NES Godzilla Creepypasta is a long one that is very much worth a read and deserves its own video. I couldn't do it justice in a short summary, so I will be making a full video covering the creepypasta. Until then, we await Red's return.
Jack the Ripper is a hidden item game where you solve the mystery of Jack the Ripper's murders by investigating his crime scenes. The author played this game as a teenager but couldn't ever get the secret ending, a game he would eventually forget about as he grew up and settled down. One day, the author found a copy of the game in a bargain bin. Purchasing the game, the author decided to play it on his next day off. Luckily for him, that day was the day after, and he was excited to relive a part of his high school years. Booting it up, he was greeted by the nostalgic text, "The Murders of Jack the Ripper." The author managed to run through the game rather quickly, only missing 2 of the secret items you find scattered across the crime scenes. The author decided to Google where to find them. Weirdly, there weren't a lot of walkthroughs for the game. Eventually, he came across a suspicious forum, one that set off his Norton's security alarm, which he ignored. Scrolling through the forum, he happened upon an interesting post, stating, "Do not play this game. If you bought it, return it. If you pirated it, delete it. It doesn't look evil, but it is. I know how that sounds, I really do. But this game is evil. Don't play it." The author waved this off as some kind of internet rumor, like Ben drowned. He did eventually find the answers to his question. The last item was in the empty hand of the blue angel creature. Booting the game up once again, he went directly to the scene where the angel is hovering over Jack's body, holding a knife. Going to the other hand, he clicked it, and the normal hidden item sound played. The last item was Jack's heart, a very realistically rendered heart at that. Then, the screen changed over to a black and white photo of a mutilated lady for an uncomfortable amount of time, before again changing, this time, the angel bringing Jack's knife down on him. The image shook the author, so he took a break before steeling himself for another playthrough, to figure out what was going on. Booting up the game, he was greeted by a different name on the screen, The Murder of Jack the Ripper. The game opened the same way, on the murder scene of Emma Smith, but this time it was much more graphic, more akin to the real murder scene, with organs strewn across the body. With each murder scene, the bodies got more and more mutilated, until he finally reached Jack's final victim, Mary Kelly, whose body was so torn apart it caused the author to throw up. When he reached the end of the game, it changed drastically, with Jack being long dead by the time they arrived, and the blue angel creature was nowhere to be seen. After the credits, he got a bonus level about Black Alice investigating the murder of a businessman who reportedly had paid Jack the Ripper to kill people. He was nailed to the wall by iron spikes. Collecting all the secret items in this twisted version of the game, including Black Alice's scalpel in Jack's room, he got a new scene depicting Black Alice murdering the businessman by nailing spikes into his hands and legs. At this moment, his wife came home, scaring him. Looking back at the screen, the murder was no longer there. Instead, just the scalpel. Turning the game off, he locked it away forever. The author is still haunted by the images of the final murder to this day.
Buried Alive, often referred to as its code, the Buryman script, was to be found in the final story of the Pokemon Tower, in what was now replaced with the Marowak Ghost. According to the scripts assigned to it, the Buried Alive model was intended to be the boss of the tower. Once reaching the top floor, the following conversations would have taken place. From Buried Alive: "You're here. I'm trapped, and I'm lonely. So very lonely. Won't you join me?" After this, the battle would have been initiated. Once in Battle View, the Buried Alive model appears to be a decaying human corpse attempting to crawl out of the ground. It has been programmed to have 2 white hands, a Gengar, and a Muck. Strangely enough, the protocol for the Buried Alive's actions after it was defeated was not written. In the case of the player defeating him, the game would freeze. However, a specific ending was written by an unknown programmer upon losing the battle. In this ending, the Buried Alive was to have stated, "Finally, fresh meat," followed by several lines of gibberish. He was to have then dragged the player character into the ground surrounding him. The scene would finish with a typical game over screen. However, in the background, an image of the Buried Alive character devouring the player was to have been shown. Especially strange are the protocols for after this scene. The cartridge was to download this image to the small internal memory contained in the Game Boy, overriding the title screen that normally accompanied a Game Boy turning it on. Instead, whenever it was started, the player would view this image as the sound file static mesh.wave was played. The intended purpose for this effect, unlike many of the other factors leading towards Lavender Town syndrome, is unknown. There was an old game called The Theater. It was pretty obscure, so obscure that many don't even believe it exists. The game was released around the same time as the original Doom, which meant it was easily overshadowed and forgotten. The cover of the game was mainly blank, but featured a single character known as the Ticket Taker. The Ticket Taker was a poorly drawn man with large red lips wearing a red vest over a white shirt and black pants. He wore a blank expression unless, that is, you broke the game disc. Many reported that his face had changed on the game case, and he was now angry looking. These claims were never substantiated. Something else of note was that the case for the game didn't show who the developer was. If you looked on the back, you wouldn't see any images from the game or a synopsis either. The game case was essentially blank with just the Ticket Taker sprite on it. The game was initially known for its inability to install correctly. Whenever you tried to install it, your computer would lock up at the license agreement screen. The workaround for this was to reboot your computer with the game disc still in the tray. The computer would ask if you agree on startup. Upon starting the game, you'll be taken to a title screen that's just a sprite of the exterior of a theater on an empty city street. After that, the menu pops up with 3 options available to you. You can start a new game, load game, or click on the options. Clicking on the options crashes the game back to the desktop. The load button does nothing even if you have a saved game already, leaving the only option to just start a new game. Once started, you are immediately playing the game in a first-person view. You are standing in an empty theater lobby. Standing across from you is the Ticket Taker, and past him is a dark hallway, presumably leading to the theaters beyond. On the walls, you can also see some distorted movie posters that are impossible to make out. Approaching the Ticket Taker, he will greet you with, "Thank you, please enjoy the movie." You are then free to walk down the hallway and towards the movie. Entering the theater will make the screen fade to black before you're back in the empty lobby again. If you walk past the Ticket Taker, he'll say the same phrase and you'll load back into the lobby again. At first glance, this game doesn't sound too great, but there's more to it. The more times you repeat this exact same sequence, the higher chance you have to trigger some odd and creepy occurrences. It's unknown how many times you need to repeat the sequence to trigger these occurrences though. The first occurrence is when the player fades back in after walking into the hallway. This time they will notice the Ticket Taker is completely absent. The player then, without any other options, decides to walk into the dark hallway. The sound clip and the text box mentioned previously still play in the absence of the Ticket Taker, but when the player walks into the hallway, the screen does not fade out. It goes pitch black as they walk deeper into the hall. But the player's footsteps sound clip is still playing as they continue to push the up button on their keyboard. Those claiming to have played the original game report to have felt extreme levels of discomfort, like something horrible was about to happen to them. Well, eventually, the player is unable to move around. There's nothing for a few moments before a strange sprite that is described as the Ticket Taker but with a swirl for a face appears and stands before the player. The original players of the game say their bodies immediately froze up and their stomachs churned when they saw this sprite, named the Swirly Head Man by the community. Nothing happens as the Swirly Head Man stands before them. Then suddenly a piercing screech plays as the game glitches out. This lasts for a few minutes, with the screeching being continuous. Then the players abruptly return to the lobby with all the sounds and graphics being as they should be. The game continues normally for the next couple of cycles of entering the hallway, with a couple of original players claiming the swirly head man would briefly appear and disappear in the corner of the screen as a brisk yelp sound effect plays. Then, at some point after meeting the swirly head man, the player sees the ticket taker pacing back and forth, though there is no walking animation. The sprite's limbs are completely static, so he just hops up and down slightly as a substitute, with his eyes being wide and his mouth open to simulate a worried facial expression. Some players noted that the movie posters had been replaced with images of the swirly head man. Then another, different, low-quality sound clip plays, but the speech box contains nothing but corrupted characters that cause whatever text that would have been in the box to be completely illegible. Due to the extremely low quality of the sound, it is debated by players what exactly the ticket taker says at this point, though it is widely agreed that he says, "Never reach the other levels." Then the screen fades out once again and returns the player back to their starting point in the lobby. But the ticket taker is gone and the hallway is blocked by a large brick wall sprite. Touching the brick wall will immediately crash the game, and that's all there is to it. No one knows what the other levels are or how to gain access to them, nor is it known why the swirly head man causes so much acute fear in those who have seen him in the game. All the original copies of the theater have either been lost or destroyed, but the creepiest part is the fact that all the original players of the game claim to occasionally see a brief glimpse of the swirly head man out of the corner of their eyes. Catastrophe Crow was a game that was in development for the Nintendo 64. It was being developed by a company named Opus Interactive under the leadership of Manfred Lorenz. The game was scheduled to release during holiday of 1999, but didn't due to multiple delays. For unknown reasons, the game was cancelled and Opus Interactive shut its doors forever. Years later, a YouTuber by the name Adam Butcher discovered a long-lost copy of the game on eBay. In his video, he discusses its history and tragic development. Catastrophe Crow, or Crow 64 as fans call it, was a game scheduled to release for the N64, but due to a multitude of complications, never did. The company went under and the game's creator disappeared. Adam, after explaining the history and how he received the game, goes on to test it on his channel. The game starts out with the title screen and some very Banjo-Kazooie-esque music. Pressing start, the game begins. In the game, you play as a crow who must save her dad's business. The game was a 3D platformer that pulled heavy inspiration from Banjo-Kazooie and Super Mario 64. The game even used a similar system for characters talking using strange noises. The game quickly deteriorates. Strange glitches along with creepy entities that appear and then disappear make the game seem like it's hiding something. A dark story of a tragic loss. The full story of Crow 64 goes very deep, as it's one of the newest video game ARGs to take the internet by storm. There's certainly too much for me to cover in this section, so I'll be returning to this topic at a later date. Polybius was an arcade game that existed sometime in the 1980s. It was only available in a few arcades in Portland, Oregon in 1981. The arcade machine was very popular with arcade goers, so much so that lines would form behind any machines. Polybius was created by a company called Sinoslotion. It was the only game that they would make. The game was so popular that it was borderline addicting for players. Even in 1981, the arcade machine seemed to be the one everyone wanted to play. There was some mystery behind the machine. The Polybius cabinets would receive weekly visits from men in black suits, likely extracting some sort of data from the machine. It was unknown what information they were pulling exactly. It was noted by many who played the cabinet that they would sometimes come away with headaches, minor forms of amnesia, night terrors, and hallucinations. These are a few of the psychoactive effects players reported. The game itself was said to play similarly to another arcade game, Tempest. The addictive properties of the game seem to have come from something other than the gameplay. It was believed that Polybius was being used for running some sort of government experiment on the people in Portland, Oregon. The game was testing psychoactive effects on the arcade goers in the area. Then that information was being collected by the men in black suits for some unknown purpose. The purpose was thought to be similar to Project MK Ultra, an experiment that tested the use of psychedelic drugs as a form of mind control, psychological torture, and interrogation tool. This was backed entirely by the CIA. Polybius was causing psychological damage to its players and is often compared to the project, though no actual connection has ever been established. The data being collected was also never released to the public. The arcade cabinet was gone a month later, seeming to vanish into thin air. The arcade owners had no records of the game, and many don't remember it even existing at all. The elusive Polybius was gone. There are many rumors about Polybius, but most of them are just that, rumors. In the early 1990s, typing games were very common. There was a lesser known typing game called Mr.Mix, which was released around the same time as Mario Teaches Typing. It starred a character named Mr.Mix who would mix ingredients into a bowl as you typed the words for him. The game was very similar to Mario Teaches Typing, which might be why it was lesser known. Another reason the game was lesser known is that it was a very hard typing game. The difficulty started out pretty low at level 1, but by level 5 the requirement became 500 words per minute, which was impossible to beat. The game was notable for having some strange background music as well. It started with low growls in the first level that would progressively get louder as the level went on. Eventually the music would get so loud that it caused permanent damage to the early computer speakers. The second level notably didn't have any music, but the third had what sounded like a low-quality recording of a hairdryer in the background. The third and fourth levels would just play a loud, high-pitched ringing sound that would persist throughout the levels. Some people even reported ear pain from the ringing sound. The design of Mr. Mix was also considered to be creepy. He was a round-faced man with beady eyes and very red cheeks. He would stare at the player as they continued to type away. Most of the children who played the game would have horrible nightmares about Mr. Mix. He would talk to them in their nightmares with his raspy, quiet voice. Mr. Mix would tell them to keep quiet about something, but it wasn't anything they could remember. It caused a few kids to develop deep psychological issues. The game had terrified them to the extent that they needed to see a psychologist. The psychologist had noted that the kids had been deeply disturbed, but no connection was ever made to the game. The game didn't sell very well for a few reasons, and almost fell entirely into obscurity. That was until a ROM of the game was discovered, with hackers immediately trying to dig through the game's files. Everything seemed fine until the hackers used a memory hack to bypass the 5th level in the game. Whenever they would bypass the 5th level, the game would crash, writing a bunch of files to the home drive of their PC. The files contained pictures of people with horribly deformed faces. They appeared to be screaming in pain and agony. Their eyes had streams of blood coming from them, and their outer layer of skin was torn off in a few places. Attempting to delete these files would cause your computer to blue screen, possibly breaking it. The hackers did find a way around this issue and were able to finally get to the last 2 levels. The original hackers unfortunately all decided they couldn't talk about it and refused to answer any questions about the game when asked. Within a month, every single hacker had gone missing. 2 years later, a man was arrested for trying to abduct a child from a supermarket. It was discovered that this man was one of the original hackers of the game. When interrogators tried to ask him any question, the only thing he would say was, "I'm Mr. Mix." I Hate You is a Super Mario World creepypasta that the author describes as not another haunted game creepypasta. The author explains how they'd played through Super Mario World so many times that they'd seen just about everything the game had to offer. One day while exploring the sunken ship level in the game, the author noticed a blind Boo hovering over the exit pipe. The only escape option was a key and keyhole above the exit that they'd never seen before. Grabbing the key and ending the level brought them back to the overworld map. A new area next to the creepy Bowser cave entrance opened up. It looked like a whirlpool, and the author thought it must be a newly undiscovered level in the game. The author moves towards the whirlpool, and as soon as Mario stands on it, the Bowser face starts to bleed from its eyes. The title of the level was "Oh God, No," which the author brushed off as being weird but not that odd since it was similar to the special stage names. Starting the level, Mario is stuck in a very small cavern with no room to jump and can only continue to the right. The further down Mario ran, eventually he would run into more of the blind Boos that the author had seen before. They floated ominously above the chamber. A giant bullet bill with blood running down its face barreled towards the author, and the only way for Mario to survive was to use a star. Of course, that meant he had to cheat to get the star. It made him invulnerable, and Mario was able to pass safely. The author noticed something was written above Mario in what looked to be blood. It said, "I hate you," in all caps. To the right of the message were a group of giant boos. To the right of the giant boos was another message. This one said, "Why won't you die?" The author was still invincible, so the boos didn't scare them at all. They continued down to where it looked like a group of thwomps were. They all had blood on the bottom of them, as if they'd crushed hundreds of victims to death just below them. The next section the author found had spikes on the floor and ceiling, meaning he would have to swim carefully between them. Of course, having invincibility helps as well. As the author swam through the area, he noticed the lifeless bodies of what looked like other Marios stuck to the spikes. This was by far the creepiest thing the author had seen up to this point. They looked to be the lives lost by Mario as he ventured through this area before. As the author made his way to the end, the lifeless Mario corpses started to float and follow him. They were terrifying to see moving around, but the author continued. At the end of the level, there was a doorway next to a weird-looking mushroom. The author decided better than to touch it and proceeded through the door. Once inside, the author realized he was in a boss chamber, but there was no one there but Mario. There were windows behind Mario, and in the third window was a mysterious shape. A second later, and Luigi stepped out onto the platform. He stared down Mario and told him how he truly felt about his brother. Luigi attacked Mario, who was too stunned to fight back. A second later, Mario, in a fit of rage, attacked back and sent Luigi flying into the lava below. Luigi shrieked out a last phrase, "Oh God, no," as Mario cried on the platform, having just killed his brother. The game comes to an ending screen showing Mario sitting next to Peach, and on the far right was Luigi, horribly burned and disfigured. In the world of Fallout 3, there are radio stations that the player can listen to as they travel the wastelands. The most interesting of these stations is Galaxy News Radio, DJ'd by a very enthusiastic man by the name of Three Dog. In Fallout 3, you can actually kill just about every character in the game. This doesn't include major plot-related NPCs, but Three Dog isn't considered an important NPC and therefore can be killed. If you kill Three Dog, then he'll be replaced by his assistant, who has none of the charm of her predecessor. She seems very reluctant to do the job, but will do it nonetheless. What most players don't know is that there's a way to turn Galaxy News Radio into a numbers station. It requires the death of Three Dog, and a certain number of other events must be completed perfectly in order to activate it. First off, a numbers station is a shortwave radio broadcast that rattles off numbers, usually in Morse or some other code. They were very popular during the Cold War, as they were thought to be used to transfer messages to intelligence officers. With the Cold War type setting of Fallout 3, a number station being in the game kind of makes sense. There's a certain number of specific criteria that must be met in order for the trigger to happen. Some of these include skipping missions, completing certain missions, and destroying Raven Rock. These, along with other not yet discovered criteria, will trigger the number station, as long as Three Dog has been killed. Once the requirements have been met and Three Dog is dead, if you turn on the Galaxy News radio station, you won't hear Three Dog or his assistant. Instead, you'll hear a very monotone sounding voice. It's Three Dog, but more like it's just the voice actor. He'll start to ramble off numbers in a very monotone voice. This is where the number station comes in, as users were quick to realize that the numbers were actually coded messages. The messages were in Morse code with dates attached. Some of the messages were pretty mundane, as one talked about his YouTube channel. Another message talked about how he's going to wash his car today. A lot of the messages were like this. Of course, there were some messages with darker undertones, such as one that listed the exact date and time of the death of Gary Coleman. Another message said, "The Queen has died today. The world mourns, as on days like this, we are all Brits." This one supposedly predicted the death of the Queen of England, which would be creepy if it wasn't for the fact that it predicted this would happen in 2014. There was one message that was rather vague. It said, "I can't believe they've actually done it. Not long left. The noise. I can't take the noise anymore. I have a pistol in the attic." The final coded message was timestamped for July 6th, 2027. We'll have to see if there's any significance to that date, but only time will tell. The Luna game was uploaded to Equestria Daily, a popular brony website, as a simple flash game. The game wasn't malicious looking in any way, so many would go on to download it. The game starred Luna and had music from Super Pony Beat playing as you jumped around the simplistic world of the game. It was a very basic platformer. The only goal was to jump from platform to platform. After 20 seconds of playing the game, one of two very dark images of Pinkie Pie or Apple Bloom would pop up on the screen. These images scared many of the players who didn't expect the jump scare in their brony game. A creepy remix of a song from the show would play along with the image. When the players tried to shut down the game, they found that they couldn't. The game couldn't be closed by clicking escape or by pressing Alt F4. The only way the game could be closed was by ending the process in the task manager. Once the game was closed, if you checked the folder where the game was downloaded, you'd see you had some new images and text files. The images were the same pictures you received at the end of your playthrough, repeated over and over again. The text files, on the other hand, all said that the end was nigh. This was also repeated in multiple files across your folder. The game was completely anonymous and no one had come forward, which made the game just a bit more creepy. It scared many players who all thought it was a virus, but it just turned out to be a prank by the developer. The game would go on to inspire 4 more games, all with similar gameplay and slightly more creepy images being used. The Luna game would even get a bit of a story to follow up the creepy prank that scared so many in the brony community. In the spring of 1989, a game was released in very limited quantity. The game, which was very popular with college students, was called Killswitch. It was created by the Carvina Corporation, and it would be their only game. Killswitch was a precursor to Silent Hill and Myst in many ways. The game's graphics were very dark, using mostly gray and white shapes against a black background. The background music used was slow MIDI versions of Czech folk songs. The game lets you play as 2 different characters. Gast, an invisible demon character who could breathe fire and had a coal stream attack. It was noticeably harder to play as him though, since he was entirely invisible. The other character you could play as was a human girl named Porto. Porto was significantly easier to play since she was visible. She lacked the strength of Porto, and her only real ability was random growth. She would get bigger and smaller randomly as players went through the game. The whole game takes place in the tunnels of a coal mine. The story is about a coal factory that started to falsify reports of malfunctions and blame the workers to excuse the low coal productions. These reports led to an investigation into the company. Later, men in red coats were shown to be stabbing workers who slowed down production at all. Clearly, it was a commentary on Soviet-era working conditions. Demonic creatures would rise up and take control of the old mining equipment in order to get revenge for the workers. The story requires Porto to travel around these dark tunnels and evade the machines, as well as the remnants of the red-coated men, which led to a lot of confusion about how to actually complete the game, as many of the puzzles were incredibly complex. Upon Porto reaching the final tunnel that led to the surface, she would make it out and the screen would just turn white. The game was completed, and as soon as it deleted itself from your computer. The game ceased to exist after that. You could not replay it at all, and it was meant to only be experienced once. A Japanese man bought the game in 2005 for over $500,000. The game was still shrink-wrapped. It was his intention to play the game for everyone and record his findings. However, he only ever uploaded one video of him playing it. It was a 1 minute and 45-second clip of him crying with the character selection screen visible over his right shoulder. In the 1980s, there existed a character so evil that he was able to kill 2 people after posting high scores on his game. The character in question is named Evil Otto, and he is the most unassuming antagonist in the history of video games. Evil Otto originates from an arcade game called Berserk. In the game, the player is tasked with fighting robots and traveling from room to room and clearing the rooms of those robots. Each room is a set of maze-like blue walls. Touching these walls would kill you as they were electrified. Getting hit by the enemy robots could also kill you. So your job was to avoid the robots and don't touch the walls. If you took too long to clear all the robots from any room, he would appear. A bouncing yellow smiley face starts to make its way straight at the player. That is Evil Otto, and he is the true face of evil. Evil Otto can go through walls, and if he touches the player, he will insta-kill them. In the case of Evil Otto, the character was claimed to have taken the life of two people who played his game. The first being a 19-year-old man. The 19-year-old, after posting his high score, suffered from a heart attack moments later and passed away. This was the first time that Evil Otto struck. A year later, an 18-year-old suffered the same fate. After posting two separate high scores in the span of 15 minutes, he also died. Evil Otto had struck again. This one has kind of become a video game urban legend, more so than a creepypasta. But the worst part is, it's true. In 1998, just about every kid had a Game Boy Color. The handheld was very popular, but there was a peripheral that not many knew about called the Game Boy Camera. It was a tiny camera that was attached to the handheld. The camera took pictures in a very low resolution, making most of the photos look distorted and strange. You could doodle on the pictures you took, and you could also play some games that the camera came with. There was a JRPG game that you could access from the main menu if you clicked on the shoot action. The game was very simple and gave you a few more options, including shoot, items, magic, check, and run. If you were to click run from the options, then you would be greeted with this picture. A doodled man's face with "Who are you running from?" written above the distorted and creepy photo. There were two other photos you could see in the US release, but even more were available in the Japan version. They all said the same thing. Who are you running from? From the face in the picture, that's what I'm running from. There was a belief that the pictures were taken of members of a cult, and that one of the images was one of their victims.
The Shadow Temple in Ocarina of Time is one of the most terrifying dungeons in a children's game. Just ask Mark, who one day decided for nostalgia's sake to buy another copy of Ocarina of Time from GameStop. He played it for hours, waves of nostalgia rushed through him as he got to relive parts of his childhood, from watching Darunia patting me on the head to easily beating Morpho. But then came the Shadow Temple. Mark had always hated the Shadow Temple, not because of the Redeads or Bongo Bongo, no, he hated it because of the mini-boss, Dead Hands. I never understood it as a child. All Nabe said was, it had infinite hands. After he drained the well in Kakariko Village, he discovered something strange at the bottom. A single dead hand. Something he didn't remember being there as a child. But it had been 30 years. Letting it grab him, he was instantly transported to Dead Hand's boss fight. During his fight, he remembered something his dead friend told him. Let all four hands grab you at the same time and something crazy happens. Which he did, but nothing happened. Well, until he grabbed the lens of truth, and the description said, "Come back here 30 years ago." Mark was confused by this. After all, he was already Child Link, how could he go back farther? Unless, of course, he meant his old save file. Digging through his old stuff again, he found his old copy at the bottom. Selecting File 1, he was spawned at the Temple of Time as Adult Link. Heading into Hyrule Town, he noticed immediately that things were different. There were no Redeads, just dead hands. Heading to Kakariko Village, it was much the same. No NPCs, just dead hands. Well, there was one NPC, the Kuko lady, who was just grabbing her head shouting, "Why? Why did you leave us with him? How could you leave us like this for 30 long years?" Mark made his way over to the well, where just like last time, a single dead hand stood sticking out of it. Letting it grab him, he once again stood in the Dead Hands boss room. Only this time, there were 20 hands. But that wasn't much of a problem, as Mark was an expert Zelda player. Soon enough, Dead Hands was defeated, or so he thought, as thousands of hands began to lift the visible part of him. Mark ran and ran, but he soon realized it was no use, as Dead Hands would always follow him. Deciding to stand and fight proved to be a mistake, as Link was torn asunder by hands. Turning off the game, Mark locked it away. Every night after that night, Mark was haunted by Dead Hands, seeing hands press up against his windows. Soon Mark stopped going out and eventually lost the will to do anything but cry. With each tear his hands grew thinner, wider, hungrier. It would seem that Mark's fate was to become one of his nightmares, infinite hands.
Mario 64 Damned tells the story of a guy and his girlfriend who are both in love with classic video games and collect them. They were pondering over some of their favorite games from their childhoods and stopped on the N64 as their favorite console. They discussed which games were the best and also both decided that Super Mario 64 was the best title to release for the console. This led to the pair deciding they wanted to find a copy of the game. Luckily for them, the narrator's uncle owned a video game store, which meant they can go and find a copy for hopefully a little cheaper than anywhere else. It took a while of searching through bins filled with games before they found the one they were looking for, Super Mario 64. They would also need a Nintendo 64, which again, luckily for them, his uncle had one left in stock. As they were about to buy the game, the uncle warned him that the game and console had been returned on multiple occasions. They had always been returned together, and the reason why was a little creepy. A few of the customers had reported that the game was evil and made in hell. That was the reasoning for returning them. The uncle never quite bought into it, but the game and console were sold and returned on 15 separate occasions. Paying it no mind, the narrator and his girlfriend bought the game, but received the console for free along with it. The two said their goodbyes to the uncle and went on their way home. As soon as they returned home, the narrator took out the console and began to hook it up to their living room TV. The narrator's girlfriend started up the game while he looked through a box of other N64 games. She played with Mario's face for a bit on the title screen before starting it up. When she got to the save file screen, there was already a game save on file 1. The save files were all started but empty, with not a single star obtained. The pair decided to delete the first file, and that's when the game froze on them, but not before a deafening screech could be heard coming from the TV. It was loud enough that they both had to cover their ears. They quickly shut the console off and the screeching stopped. They turned on the console again to find that the first file that they'd tried to delete now had 66 stars on it. They proceeded to try and delete it again. The screeching started, but was louder this time, and the narrator had to pull the plug from the wall. After cleaning the game, which was pretty dusty, they started the game again and all the files were empty this time, as a new game usually would be. The narrator chalked it all up to the game just being dirty. The game played normally until they reached the castle doors. Opening them started the screeching again, but it only lasted 30 seconds before the game loaded into Big Boo's haunt. The level didn't quite look right. It looked way creepier than it had in previous playthroughs. The castle now loomed over Mario with blood and rust covering its walls. The sky was now a mix of black and red, and there were new parts on the castle where there hadn't been previously. The narrator started to move Mario, but as soon as he did, something fell from the sky. The pair stared in shock at the screen as they saw Mario hanging from a noose with cuts all over his body. There was blood all over his clothes, but the worst part was that Mario's mouth and eyes were both sewn shut. After the narrator unplugged the console again, the pair just sat on the couch for a while to process what they'd just seen. The narrator and his girlfriend decided they should call it a night. They decided they would return the game in the morning once the store had opened. The narrator, lying awake still, decided he would try the game again while his girlfriend slept. He crept into the living room and started up the console, selecting the second game file this time. The narrator got more gruesome scenes of Mario, Peach, and Toad strewn all about the castle. Mario was strapped to a table and Peach, along with Toad, were both already dead. The sickening sight made the narrator nearly vomit. The game continued to show Mario pleading for his life to be ended. A dark figure simply known as the Black Mass floated over to Mario and began to torture him. Mario struggled but ultimately could not survive his torment. The game ends with the player trying to ascend some stairs and finding a man hanging from the tower. It took him a second to realize that the man that was hanging was him. He had received the same treatment as Mario. His mouth and eyes were sewn shut, but before he could shut off the game, the body double began to scream. Mario turned and began to wail at the narrator as well. The narrator then fell unconscious, but not before he saw the black mass hovering over him.
We've all seen those anti-piracy videos that play before a movie. You know the ones, you wouldn't steal a car, would you? Well, what if one of those turned deadly? That's what happened to our dear author, who one day bought a copy of Mario Party DS from a thrift store. At first, nothing seemed amiss with the game, it played like normal. But then he went to the shop, and Monty Mole said he doesn't serve criminals. Before a weird minigame started to play, where Monty started chasing him. The screen started to glitch and he got an anti-piracy screen. It turns out that the thrift store sold him an illegal copy. Turning the game off and on, it went straight to the same screen, except the characters seemed angry. He repeated this a few times with the image getting more and more creepy, until the characters were gone, and were instead in his room attempting to kill him. Breaking the cartridge seemed to dispel whatever had happened. The author vowed to never play another pirated game again.
There were rumors in the early 90s of a video game console with extremely impressive graphics, gameplay, and very intelligent AI. The console was very rare though, with only 50 being in circulation. The console had a short list of games, but everyone only seemed to remember the first one on the list. The game was said to have the most realistic graphics for any video game, even by today's standards. The game had an endless supply of new content and solid gameplay. It was said that the game could almost predict how you were going to play, meaning no lag between the player and the game. The game was so perfect that literally no one wanted to stop playing. The author of the story notes that the people he talked to remembered that their parents forced them to stop playing and had even thrown out the consoles with the game. The author searched for a while after that, hoping to find someone who had more time with the game. After a month of searching, he found two individuals that had vague recollections of the game. They described the game as having a perfect interface. After he questioned further, they explained that the game seemed to have a direct effect on the player. Playing the game seemed to give the player exercise, and the player was able to go without food or water for days, like the game was providing them with sustenance. After playing the game for a week straight, they started to notice that when the character in game would get hurt, they would also feel that pain. It started out small at first, but got worse the longer they played. One of the players remembers a boss using a whip that was a one-hit kill. The pain was immense from every lashing he had received in game. It was even worse because he had to replay the level over and over again. They would have kept playing if their parents also hadn't thrown out their consoles. For a while there were no leads following these two accounts, until the author stumbled upon reports of people being found dead in front of bootleg video game consoles. They seemed to have a butchered appearance, with many of them being found in pieces. Autopsies later revealed that their internal organs had also been dissolved. Whenever they were found, all the responders would see were the bodies and the bootleg console plugged into a TV, playing nothing but static. The author was playing games on the Xbox Live Arcade when he got an invitation to an Xbox Live party chat. The invitation didn't have a gamer tag attached to it, it just said blank has invited you to an Xbox Live party. And when he entered, he was the only person in the party. The author didn't think much of it, as the person who invited him could have left before he joined, or it could have been a glitch in the system. Glitches happened often on Xbox Live and happened just as often in the Xbox Live party chats. Right as the author was about to leave, another name popped up in the party. It was his name again, so there were two of him in the party according to Xbox Live. He thought it was another glitch, but said hello anyway. A few seconds had passed before an echo of his voice said hello back. The author was annoyed but kept talking to himself in chat. Eventually he would say, "Why don't you come say that to my face?" "Maybe I might just do that," the voice said back, and startled him. It was his voice that had responded. The other version of him left the chat and he was once again alone. The author would receive another message from the other account before his Xbox broke with the smell of smoke coming from it. He tried to turn it back on and got the red ring of death, a problem that a lot of early Xbox 360s had. The story would end with the narrator getting his Xbox fixed and finding dozens of voice messages from the account with his name. The final voice message said, "I'm done waiting, I'm coming to get you." The last thing the author saw was his avatar on screen waving, but it wasn't at him. Hypno is a psychic Pokemon that is known for the ability to hypnotize others. The creepypasta Hypno's Lullaby is a song written by Hypno using its power on children. The song details how Hypno will hypnotize kids in a very similar way to the Pied Piper legend. He takes the children from their homes with his song and leads them to his cave, then hypnotizes them all together according to the song. The children are then presumably killed. It never says exactly what Hypno does with the children. The song also mentions how he will feed on the nightmares of the families that are going to have to grieve for their children, which might have been Hypno's ultimate goal from the start. So anyone who's been on the V board on 4chan probably knows about Mr. Bones' Wild Ride. For those who don't, it was a ride someone made for Roller Coaster Tycoon. It was one of those really slow motor car rides, but with a twist. It had 30,696 feet of track and a ride time of 70 real-time minutes, around 4 years in game time. In addition, there were these props of a skeleton holding out his top hat scattered around here and there. as if to mock the customers. Needless to say, there were a lot of passengers screaming, "I want to get off Mr. Bones' wild ride." Now here's where things get really good. Once the ride came to a stop, the passengers found themselves on a long path that took about 2 hours to traverse. Once they reached the end, they found themselves facing a sign that read, "Mr. Bones says, the ride never ends." The path led straight back to the entrance of Mr. Bones' wild ride. There was nowhere else to go. In other words, they were screwed. Needless to say, this gained a lot of popularity on V, and people started making their own Mr. Bones' wild ride. I was one of them and made a version with the ghost train ride. You know, the one that's usually a huge death trap? It didn't last as long as the original, but it did have a twist. Near the end, it launched the cars into a small shed with a sign on the side that said, "Enjoy your stay." I killed about 20 people with that ride and couldn't stop laughing as each of them went one by one to their graves. Fast forward a few weeks and I was in Busch Gardens on vacation. I was wandering around trying to decide what to ride. That's when I noticed a ride that hadn't been there the last time I visited. It was weird because it had never been advertised and there was nothing on the map about it. I figured, what the hell, and got in line. Surprisingly, the line wasn't very long. I only waited about 10 minutes to get on. It was one of those motor car rides, which is kind of weird because they already had one elsewhere in the park. Why would they open up a second one? After buckling in, I looked up ahead and froze. There was a giant skeleton up ahead tipping a hat to me with a sign over his head that said, "Mr. Bones' Wild Ride." "No," I whispered. I struggled with my restraints, but they wouldn't come off. I begged the employee controlling the ride to help and that I had changed my mind, but he ignored me. My car started moving and I screamed in terror. Up ahead, the track stretched on for what seemed like forever. I want to get off Mr. Bones' Wild Ride. Do you remember the stories you and your friends would tell each other on the playground? Your friend would say that they found a way to unlock Luigi in Super Mario 64. All you had to do was collect every single star in the game and do a few other menial tasks. Then Luigi would be available to play. So you went home that night and loaded up the game. You spend the rest of the week collecting every single star and finishing up every other requirement. The weekend hits just as you finish everything. You go to unlock Luigi and then, nothing. Luigi never appears, at least not in your game. You go back to your friend on Monday and ask him how he did it, and that you didn't get Luigi. Your friend swears up and down that he was able to do it though. What if Luigi wasn't in your copy of Super Mario 64, but was only in your friend's copy of the game? Super Mario 64 might be the first and only personalized video game. Every copy of Mario 64 is personalized to a different person. Every strange experience people have with the game comes from their own copies of the game. Some players may experience Luigi in their game, 4L is real. Some players may unlock the Ghoul Medal from Big Boo's Haunt. Yet even more players might discover minor changes that hardly change the game from copy to copy. Every copy of the game is unique and has its own features. Most are harmless and interesting, but if you see a giant floating Wario head in the game, it is recommended that you turn off the game immediately. Zelda 64 Beta tells the story of a Zelda fan who gets his hands on a red Nintendo 64 cartridge with nothing but Zelda written on it. He gets the game from a friend who received it from a woman whose son had gone missing. The friend didn't see the value in it, and so he gave the game to the author of the story. He took the game home and immediately started playing it. The first thing he saw was the title screen, just had The Legend of Zelda written on it. Nothing really in the background, no music and no animation. It was eerie for a Zelda game, which usually had this whimsical and fantasy-themed opening. He also noticed how the graphics were actually more detailed than Ocarina of Time, which didn't make sense since it was supposed to be the beta for that game. The graphics were better for the environment, but everything also looked more grotesque and realistic. The author would roam the world until finding a dungeon of sorts. It was well detailed, but the building looked gross, dingy, and rotten. There were blood splatters on certain walls of the dungeon to show where traps were located, something not common for the Zelda franchise, with the whole vibe being creepy and far darker than any previous Zelda game had been. Music began to play inside the dungeon the more he explored it. Moans were mixed with a discordant violin melody that played in the background. The moaning wouldn't loop, and it seemed to change based on the mood of what was happening in the game. The author goes on to detail a fleshy face built into a wall. He had to attack it until it died, and once it did, a door opened behind the face. Soon after, he realized he was in the tutorial of the game and had yet to see what the game truly had to offer. The world seemed to expand the more he explored it. Each time he restarted the game, it would have a different layout. He would get lost exploring the areas he felt familiar with every time he loaded the game. There were monsters that were just arms that would come out of the wall and throw him straight into traps if he was caught. Other monsters in the game were similar to what they would be like in subsequent Zelda games. For weeks on end, the author would explore the world of Zelda 64 beta and find something new every time he played. He discovered the gods of that world and the lore that it contained. He was unable to stop playing the game. The game seemed to know he was playing and was creating new things for him to do. The game was changing specifically for him, and it wasn't content with him to just stop playing. A bootleg Pokemon game collector is excited to receive a new Pokemon game that he found called Pokemon Black. It wasn't Black version, but instead a hack of Pokemon Red. It followed the same opening, and the only major differences was the press start screen didn't have the Pokemon cycling through. Also, under the Pokemon logo, it just said Black version. The game started as normal with the player getting to pick their first Pokemon, but no matter which Pokemon you picked, you also got a Pokemon called Ghost added to your party. He used the Ghost sprite from Lavender Town and was easily the most powerful Pokemon in the game. Ghost had one ability, Curse. When used, it would instantly defeat whatever Pokemon you were facing. What was weird was instead of the Pokeball being grayed out to show a defeated Pokemon, instead the Pokeball was just missing entirely. This was most likely to show that the Pokemon had died from the attack. Once Ghost had used Curse against the entire team of Pokemon, the trainer would show up next. The battle commands would come back up. You could run and the fight would end normally. Or you could use Curse on the trainer as well. After the battle ended, the trainer's sprite would be missing. If you returned to the same spot at a later time, then you'd see a gravestone where the trainer used to stand. Curse could not be used in all instances though. It was useless against ghost Pokemon, presumably because they are already considered dead. It also could not be used against trainers you'd have to fight again. That is, unless it's your final battle against them, then you could use it. The game had a sudden shift after defeating the Elite Four. A box would appear with the words "many years later" written in it. The player character was now an old man standing and looking at tombstones. The game world was now as empty as your Pokemon party. Even Ghost was no longer in your party. As you traveled the world as the old man, Lavender Town's theme would play on loop. No other songs played, just Lavender Town. The player would then make their way back to Pallet Town where the game had started. Going into your house and standing on the exact spot where the game had started would start a cutscene. The game would show a Caterpie, then a Weedle. It took a moment for the author to realize that the game was showing all the Pokemon the player had used Curse on. After the Pokemon had gone by, next would be the trainers. Every trainer you had cursed would show up one by one. The Lavender Town theme in the background all the while had begun to drop in pitch until it was just a low rumble. Following this, a battle would start. The old man's sprite would appear and Ghost would be on the opposite side. The only option available to the player would be to fight. The option to run wasn't available. When the old man tried to fight, the only ability he could use was Struggle. Struggling would lower the old man's health, but it didn't affect Ghost at all. Eventually, the old man would struggle down to his last bit of life and Ghost would finally use Curse. The screen would cut to black for a final time. The player had one option, and that was to turn off the game, or let it sit on the black screen forever. Restarting the game, the author noticed that the file was gone, and it had been erased like it never existed. Little Lamplight is an alternate story of how the Wanderer, the main character in Fallout 3, was able to access the vault in Little Lamplight. Little Lamplight was a settlement run entirely by kids. It was also the only way into the final vault that you needed to access. After being turned away by the kids of Little Lamplight, the Wanderer would work with a group of slavers to overrun the settlement and sell the kids into slavery. The Creepypasta recounts the story from the perspective of the leader of the settlement, as he tries in vain to stop everything from happening. He is powerless in the end, and they are all taken and sold off one by one. Eventually the story ends with the Wanderer making his way into the vault that previously he wasn't allowed entry.
Regrets can be a tricky thing, as they can seemingly bond to anything or anyone with no real reason. Just ask the author, let's call him Percy for the sake of flow, who after saving up enough money to buy an Xbox 360 plus some games soon finds some weird things happening. It starts off with some small things, like the games getting easier when he yells at them, like in Borderlands, to visual glitches in the title screen of Blaze Blue. But then, Percy starts to hear voices. Freaked out, he rushes out of the lounge to wash his face, and reasoning with himself that it might just be his flatmate. Returning to the console, he started playing Blaze Blue once more, and while there was still visual glitches, the voice seemed to be gone for now. After a few matches, he once again heard the voice. Behind the microphone, and headset, in the box. Freaked out, he checked the box, and there lay a headset, which is weird since he had not purchased one, and the Xbox did not come with one. The voice introduced herself as Cass. "What are you doing in my console?" Percy asked Cass. Cass responded that she had been bound to him, and the Xbox was the first means she had of contacting him, as his other consoles had no microphone feature, save for his DS, but the microphone on it was broken. Tired, Percy turned off his console and passed out on his couch. The next morning when he turned on his console, Cass was annoyed. "Why didn't you say goodbye?" she asked. A little creeped out, this time after turning off the console, he told her that he'd be in contact as soon as possible, which would be sooner than he expected, as the following morning a headset seemed to appear out of nowhere, attached to his DS. Cass had found a way to fix the microphone on it. Freaked out, Percy asked, "Excuse me, but why are you wanting to remain in contact with me so often?" Her response sent chills down his spine. "You've had a hard time with your life, haven't you? You've had nobody to talk to all your life, right?" How did she know? He never told anybody. Turns out they can see each other's memories, something he'd experience soon, as he started to see her memories, specifically her death, where she was stabbed by her employer and left bleeding on the ground, before he stuck something into her head, leaving her an empty shell. The next thing she knows, she's being woken up by his next victim. Shortly after learning this, Percy collapses, then wakes up in what appears to be a hospital ward. Cass is there. It seems that he has gone to where she is, his body doomed to become an empty shell. Stepping into the white door, he embraces Cass as they enter oblivion together, waiting for the next victim. The monitor turns off for a second before the words "console subjects 4, beginning transition of fourth subject to target number 5 appear. Who will be the next to be consoled? Perhaps it will be you.
The author is a lonely child who was forced to attend a private school. They were shy and didn't have any friends, as most of their classmates were rude to them. This all led to the author finding video games as their only chance for socialization and joy. They received a GameCube with 3 games, one of these being Pokémon Channel. The author played the other 2, but Pokémon Channel quickly became their favorite game. The author would play it every day. She would run around with Pikachu, watch TV, and play minigames. The bond that she felt with Pikachu, who she named BRVR for brother, was that of a real best friend. BRVR was her only friend. That was until she switched to a public school and started to make real friends. The author even had a best friend that she made at school. The more and more she hung out with her friends, the less time she spent playing Pokémon Channel. After a while, the author had completely stopped playing Pokémon Channel. She spent all of her time with her best friend until her family had to move. She fought with her parents about it, but ultimately they had to move anyway. She soon lost contact with her best friend. The author fell back into her old habits of playing video games and never leaving her room. She was perusing her old games and found her old dust-covered copy of Pokémon Channel. A wave of nostalgia rushed over her and she decided she had to play it again. She had to see Brother again. The game loaded up and she felt the wave of nostalgia even stronger now. It almost brought a tear to her eye. The same loading screen, the same menu music, and now it was time to start the game. The author's room loaded, but she couldn't find Brother anywhere. Eventually, a low moan came from the bed. She looked over and saw Pikachu climbing out from under the bed. He looked sad and beat up. The author called out to Pikachu, but got a stern look in return. Brother was mad, and she couldn't figure out why. He had this look of absolute disdain, something that the author wasn't even sure was possible in the game. The game slowly devolved. The TV was replaced with a gory Pikachu-themed one that looked like its mouth was spread wide around the TV screen. A small stream of blood coming from the top of the mouth. It was frightening and definitely not part of the game originally. The wallpaper in the room has taken on a creepy design that made the walls look like they were covered in dry blood. A group of morbid-looking Pikachu dolls, called Pikachu Doll Z, were placed all around the room. Brother showed the author around the world that was now submerged in death. The dead body parts of Pokemon were strewn around their garden. Brother seemed to relish in ruining the world that the author used to love. The game ends with Brother telling the author that she left him alone for too long. The screen fades to black with the face of Brother staying on screen. When the author turns to look away, she sees the Pikachu doll Z sitting on her desk. The author was feeling nostalgic for Super Mario 64 when he happened upon a mint condition copy online. He was watching some gameplay on YouTube when the pop-up showed up on his screen. He was of course weary of a random pop-up, but his nostalgia took over and he bought it. The buying process was also very strange. The message he'd received only asked him to send $10 to an address the seller had listed. Once he'd received that, the author would be sent his game. Once he'd sent off the money, the website seemed to go offline. His game arrived a few days after he'd sent the money. Of course, the offer was too good to be true and it wasn't a mint copy of the game. In fact, the front cover had been entirely removed, and instead a piece of duct tape with Mario was written on it crudely. The game luckily still worked and the author was relieved. He booted it up and got to the opening screen where you could mess with Mario's face. He moved the hand around and started to morph his face in a funny way. Just as he did this, Mario's face began to distort in ways he never thought possible. Random sound effects played and a faint voice speaking Japanese played in the background. The person seemed to be stammering and on the verge of tears. The author restarted the game and skipped directly to starting a new game. After loading in, the game skipped a lot of the intro and just put Mario inside the castle. There was no music, just dead silence. There weren't even any toads around to talk to. The portrait entrance to Pacm Battlefield was just a stark white canvas for some reason. Once the author entered the portrait, the image suddenly went from a blank canvas to the lethal lava land painting. The mission select menu came up, and instead of Big Pacm on the summit, the mission was called Turn Back. Once the author entered the level, it all seemed normal until he saw Luigi. Luigi just stood there until Mario approached him. Luigi took off running at a crazy fast speed. The author chased and picked up coins along the way. As the author picked up the coins, the game seemed to change around him. The colors were more mute with each coin, and everything was just a little darker. As he picked up the 5th coin, all the enemies dropped to the floor, as if they'd all simultaneously died. Mario chased Luigi up to where King Pacm usually stood. At the top was a very out-of-place looking cottage. The walls were worn and old, it appeared so stark against the background of the Mario world. As soon as Mario entered the cottage, the door slammed behind him and for a brief moment an image of Luigi appeared on the screen. It was Luigi hanging from the ceiling, his lifeless body swaying slightly from side to side. Mario then fell to the floor and cried for 5 minutes straight as the screen went to black. The screen came back to Mario slumping out of the painting. The painting now showed the same image of Luigi. Across the hall from the Luigi painting was something that scared the author a lot more. It was a picture of him and his family, a very recent photo they had taken last weekend. The author tried in vain to turn the console off. He even unplugged it from the wall, but nothing seemed to work. The screen still showed his family, and it seemed his only option was to enter the new level. The author took control of Mario and jumped into the family photo. A mission named Run, Don't Walk came on screen. It was the only mission available to him. The author was plopped on some platforms and had to run from a giant blob that chased Mario. He kept running, always staying just slightly ahead of it. That couldn't last forever, so Mario was eventually absorbed by the blob. The picture ejected Mario and he lost one of his 3 lives. The picture had changed somehow. The author and his family looked like they were starting to decay, like they had all died and been posed as corpses. The author shrugged this off and jumped back in. Again, Mario died and he was sent back out of the picture. The picture had gotten worse. Everyone was looking like they'd been dead for a longer time now. One last time, the author thought as he jumped back into the picture. This time Mario was on a lonely island surrounded by nothing but water. A sign told him to dive and he jumped into the water and began to dive down. The waters were empty as he made his way down. It was quiet until out of nowhere Mario was eaten by the giant eel from the game. And just like that, he was out of extra lives. The game showed a grotesque picture of the family in the last photo that the author had taken. He was so disgusted, but glad that he could actually shut the system down. When he tried to reload the game, all he got was the same picture and no option to do anything else. The author decided to open the only other file in the game. The grotesque picture came up again, but only it looked a little different. They were posed differently, and that was when he realized that it was a different family.
How far are you willing to go to uncover the truth? Would you endanger yourself for your own curiosity? It would seem the author would. The author considered himself a fan of all things creepy in video games. One day, the author decided to find the secrets of the Hell Valley Skytrees from Super Mario Galaxy 2. The author had heard of a theory that the ghosts from Super Mario 3D World and the trees were linked, so he began his own research by playing through Super Mario Galaxy 2. He eventually came upon the Shiverburn Galaxy, where the Hell Valley Skytrees were located. Entering first-person mode to see them, they weren't there, and confused, the author left first-person view, to find that they had surrounded Mario, and proceeded to grab him. The screen went black, and all he could hear was Mario's horrifying screams, before the figures turned to him and the words, "Seek no further, thou foolish man," were spoken by an unknown voice. The author ignored the warning. He began digging for more information on the trees, going to forums and even contacting Nintendo, but he found nothing. That night he had a nightmare of the shadowy figures surrounding him. Shooting up from his bed, clearly shook, the author stumbled into the living room. Booting up his Wii, he loaded up Super Mario Galaxy 2. Instead of being greeted by the menu, he was met with the face of his Mii, with no eyes and a frown. When he selected this file, he was spawned in the Shiverburn Galaxy, where the trees usually were, looking down on Mario, who was staring up. Then, the screen flashed, and he was staring at the trees, standing around a dead Mario, before telling the author that he must pay for digging too deep. Then, the power went off in his house. It ends with the author warning people not to look into the trees. Well, where it ends for him. On October 16, 2012, a homicide report states that this was found in the victim's pocket. It would seem the author's curiosity led to his death. There's actually another creepypasta that mentions seeing eyes above the trees, in the exact same spot the author had been looking down on Mario, and how they would send over this information to their cousin, who loved creepypastas. Let's hope his curiosity doesn't get the better of him.
The Princess is the story about a strange entity known as the Princess. This entity has the ability to appear in any video game that they please and interact with the player. The player is advised that if they ever see her, they need to turn off the game. The Princess can travel into any game she wishes. Once inside, she'll begin to change the game in different ways. Usually the things she'll change are pretty easy to recognize. They also corrupt the game in unforeseeable ways. The Princess may enter any video game she wants, and anyone can see her. Though she usually avoids online games and the newer stuff. She prefers older titles and N64 games, with an apparent fondness for Ocarina of Time. The story of the Princess starts with the author talking about an untextured and weird-looking NPC that he found in The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. She had red hair and wore a white dress. Both of these would become staples of her character. The most striking thing about her, though, wasn't really something she had, but rather what she didn't. The Princess was faceless. When the author tried to interact with her, he was knocked back like Link had hit an enemy. This led the author to believe that she was an enemy of some type. She persisted in that same spot until he left the area. When he returned, she was gone. The author would run into her a few more times while playing through the game. The very last time he would run into her, he finally got some dialogue out of her. She said, "He's not moving anymore." What? Are you sad? Happy? I really can't tell. Looks like you're coming around. That's an unpleasant mask. Along with the dialogue box was a high-pitched screeching sound. The princess's character model was also shaking in place. The author immediately left the area. Following this event, the game was becoming less and less stable. Finally, the author would make his way to the marketplace where all the NPCs were acting strange. After talking to all the NPCs, the screen would flash and show the princess entity along with the "Re-Dead" scream. The author finally reached over and shut off the console. He would then put away Ocarina of Time for a while. When he did get around to playing it again, the game seemed normal. This was one of the stories that revolved around the princess, the entity that haunted a multitude of video games. The story goes into length explaining her backstory and what she's capable of, and also introduces the Princess Society. But I'm going to hold off here as she really deserves a full video. So remember, friends, if you see her, turn off the game. Attract Mode tells the story of a kid whose friend named Nicholas goes missing while they're at the arcade. They were both playing a game called Skull and Crossbow. The game was very alluring to the author, as it was very loud with pulsating bass. The author starts the game and finds that he's actually kind of good at it. The game was essentially just like Centipede, another arcade game that he was already familiar with, though it was much darker in nature. The author was getting very into the game, and he was slowly beating the final boss. Just as this happened, Nicholas came up and pushed him out of the way so he could play the game too. He essentially stole the finale of the game from the author. Nicholas ended up losing and started reaching behind the machine to unplug it. His logic was that if you unplug the arcade, you can claim a free game from the arcade owners. The author didn't love the plan but was on board since he really wanted to finish the game. As the boys tried to jostle the machine away from the wall, they were shocked to find that the game had no back. It was just a black void that Nicholas started to fall into. The author tried to grab him, but it was too late. He was gone. When the author looked back at the front of the screen, he swore the main boss of the game, Oad, had another set of ribs on him. Attracted has 2 more sequels that expand upon the author character's slow descent into becoming a sociopath. I'll probably do a full video on this series as there's a lot of subject matter I want to cover. You know that eerie feeling you get when playing a multiplayer game alone on a server meant for multiplayer? Like you were meant to be surrounded by people, but it's just you and you alone. That's the hobby of the author of abandoned servers. He would explore those servers that players didn't use anymore. He even got paid to do it. The author receives a call from his friend asking him to check out an indie game's abandoned server. He was told the server was pretty big and offered him $100 to go through and document what he found. The author created an account which was hosted on some very old website. He logged in and noticed that the game was very similar to Second Life, the game where you play as yourself and build by a second online life. The server that the author was in turned out to be the only active server left in the game. He was loaded into a forest-like area where the trees looked very similar to the ones from WoW. The first thing that he really noticed was the graphics that looked pretty good, even for a game its age. After walking around in the forest for about 20 minutes, the author came to a big tree. The tree had a giant door on the front of it. The door looked similar to the doors on the trees in The Nightmare Before Christmas. Clicking on the door brought up a loading screen. The game played an 8-bit tune as it took its time loading. When the game finished loading, the only thing inside the tree was a big mirror. The mirror was big enough that it separated one part of the tree from the other. The author's character walks up to the mirror and reaches his hand towards his reflection. After this, the game closes and shoots him back to the desktop. The game was gone from his desktop and all its related folders disappeared too. Confused, the author shoots his friend a message. He asks if he already cut the servers and the only reply he got was no. Later that night, he woke several times from dreams about the tree and the mirror. Every time he's about to touch it, he wakes up. The author decides to get up and browse Steam since he couldn't sleep. After looking through some trailers, he received an invite to play Counter-Strike Source. The name was someone on his friends list, but he didn't recognize it. It just sort of resembled his name. The author loaded into the map and couldn't buy any guns for some reason. Every time he tried, it would freeze for a second and then return to normal. He gave up and just proceeded with his starting gun. The map was empty save for him and the person who invited him. The author ran around the map for a while but never saw the enemy player. He was about ready to quit when he saw the other player out of the corner of his eye. The author chased him under a bridge but couldn't catch him. When he emerged on the other side of the tunnel, he found himself back inside the tree. Someone was reflecting in the mirror. It was him. Not his character in the game, but him at his desk wearing his headphones and everything. The reflection of the author starts to rip into its arm with its nails. The marks began to appear on the author's arm along with the pain. He screamed before shutting the computer off. As the screen faded to black, the doppelganger's face began to rot and distort. 4 days later, the author gathers the strength needed to turn his computer back on. He attempts to open Word, but it shuts down and starts to load Battlefield 3. An old friend has invited him, but he was suspicious. The author joined his group and tried to talk to his friend, but only got static in return. He attempted to shut the computer off, but as he looked back at the monitor, he saw all of the trees in the game now had the same door on them. Frantically jabbing the button with his thumb, he came to realize he couldn't turn it off. As he looked back at his monitor, he saw a familiar face looking back at him. It was his doppelganger again. His face was shriveled to where bone was visible, his eyes were sunken in, and he overall looked like death. The author's doppelganger began to jab a piece of wood into himself repeatedly. The wounds started to appear on the author, and he let out a scream as he pulls the plug from the computer. His doppelganger screams as the computer shuts off. The author calls an ambulance as he has some serious injuries. He was rushed to the hospital and overall required stitches for his wounds. As he's healing, he decides to sell his computer. The author's life starts a downhill trend. He loses his job for missing too many days. He can't stop thinking about the doppelganger in the tree. They continue to haunt his dreams. He has spent too many nights without proper sleep and it was driving him insane. The author finally comes up with an idea to rid himself of his nightmare. He buys a cheap Dell computer and sets it up at his home. After 3 days of working, he finally gains access to the same server where his doppelganger resides and sets up a peer-to-peer connection. Once the author was online, he was greeted by a very different page of the game. It had news of him losing his job, as well as people being killed, cannibalism, and other heinous acts being shown. The author makes his way through the game, which is now covered in the corpses of people. He must make his way past all of them and get to the tree. It was his only chance to overcome this nightmare. Once inside the tree, he finds a very deformed and menacing looking version of himself. The deformed, bloody creature begins to crawl towards him. The doppelganger breaks through the glass, and just as he was about to reach the author, he pulled out a pocket mirror. His doppelganger lets out a cry as a massive burst sound comes from the game. The author woke up on the floor covered in blood with the mirror laying beside him. It must be over, he thought. The author drove over to a bridge and threw the mirror into the waters below, hoping to finally be rid of the nightmare. He warns that you should be careful when exploring abandoned servers, to be wary of the laughs and cries you may hear, as you may also meet your very own doppelganger. JVK1166Z.ESP was a strange mod for the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. The mod was only passed around smaller Elder Scrolls message boards and communities. It was even sent to a few people via personal messages. The mod wasn't so widespread, and that was likely due to the fact that if you tried to load the mod on your computer, it would likely crash the game. It would sit on the loading screen for an hour before it crashed, taking all of your save files with it. This led to warnings being distributed into most areas of the community, meaning the game was mostly being treated like a virus that was being spread around the community like a real virus would. A year later, the author of the story was messaged by someone who got PM'd a copy of the mod. In the PM, he was told that the game could run in DOSBox, which ended up working. The mod was now playable, even if it was laggy and it wouldn't allow you to save unless you used the quick save feature. JVK, as the board started to call it, started the game with every NPC that was important to the plot already being dead, essentially making the game unbeatable from the very start. Kind of like starting the game on a game over. It was noted that even though the NPCs were dead, you could still go and find their corpses as they were never despawned. Another important change was that your character would lose health as you played the game. I don't mean from receiving damage, but just as time passed. It was a little bit at a time, but more so if you played the game too slow. If you actually ran out of health, your character, like in most games, would die. When your character died, you'd see what the cause was. A figure would crawl all over the character's dead body just before the game asked if you wanted to load a save. This figure would become known in the community as the Assassin. He could mainly be seen after your character has died, or on very rare occasion, he could be seen just out of the corner of your eye. He would be gone before you could turn to look at him. The assassin crawled like a spider on all four limbs and was very fast. He would crawl out of sight every time you thought you could catch a glimpse of him. He was even able to crawl up walls and trees, making the game a little hard to play at night. The only other noticeable difference was that at night, all of the NPCs would walk outside at random intervals and just stare upwards. If you try to talk to them, all they will say is, "Watch the sky." They will randomly stop and go back to normal after a short time. A new NPC named Tyrius has appeared in the game. He was pretty standard except for his robe, which seemed to be a unique item. It was rendered with twinkling stars all across it, looking like a torn chunk of the night sky. Tyrius had one quest line and it required you to go to the new dungeon added in the mod, the Citadel. The dungeon was by far the largest in the game and the hardest as well. It required you to make your way toward an island where the dungeon was located. The Citadel was considered harder due to the lack of proper save feature. At this point, the author quit the mod. The author then recounts the stories of what they were told by the others who continued onward. The Citadel contained areas that looked like Dwemer ruins, but darker. The rooms were black instead of bronze, and that included the creatures in the area as well. The sounds of machinery could be heard all around the player, and it grew louder the further in you went. There was even a thick fog which limited the player's vision to about 10 in-game feet. If you made it through all of that, you'd end up in an area the community has come to know as the Portrait Room. The Portrait Room was a room that pulled random pictures from your My Pictures folder on your computer. The room was filled with whatever picture files you had, which led to some very interesting situations. At the end of the hallway, past the Portrait Room, was a door. The door was locked, and none of the players could figure out how to get it open. Everyone returned to Tyrius to figure it out, but all he would say was, "Watch the sky." One player, a friend of the author, decided that it had something to do with the night sky. He figured that "watch the sky" was in reference to the way the sky now looked like a real sky. His friend had figured out that the sky seemed to correlate to real time that just moved at a faster pace. His friend had to keep the game on though, because if you restarted for any reason, then it would reset the time back to the starting date. The game had to be on, but he couldn't let it sit still for too long or the assassin would kill his character and he'd have to start over again. His friend decided that he needed to keep the game running for 3 in-game years, which was the equivalent to 3 real-life days. After a little bit of time goes by, his friend finds that the assassin has a new method of scaring the player. He now shrieks at them. The first time it happened, his friend wasn't paying attention and it nearly scared the life out of them. He persisted still until he got to day 3 and the assassin shrieked at him again. His friend looked around and saw that all the NPCs were outside now. The only thing they would say was "watch the sky." After that, his friend took some time away from the game. When he did get back in contact with the author, he talked about having suffered from sleep deprivation. His friend was once again trying to figure out the mod. His friend woke up from several nightmares. His first nightmare had the assassin looming over him in the real world. When he tried to push him away, his hands melted into him. After that, he woke to his character not being near where he'd left him. Instead, he was talking to an NPC, and he was telling him about how the door would open soon. His friend then awoke for a final time, actually being awake this time. He found his character swimming towards the Citadel Island, but he heard this tapping noise on the window to the left of him, which was strange since his laptop was on the table to the right of him. This was the last message that the author would receive from his friend. He has since considered re-downloading the mod and running through it again.
The author's best friend, Mike, had a Let's Play channel, where he played obscure games. It wasn't a big channel, but he seemed to enjoy it. One day, Mike started to play a game called LSD Dream Simulator. In this game, the player would explore various Japanese environments, with animals and people floating by who paid no heed to the player. Except for an NPC known as the Gray Man, who, as he sounds, is the gray man in a hat and coat. Each time he appeared, Mike would laugh nervously before moving on. After getting to day 12, Mike made a post on his YouTube channel about dreaming about the Gray Man, and how it was time to play a different game. The next day at school, Mike seemed anxious, so the author suggested he take a break from YouTube and study with him. That night when the author arrived at Mike's house, he seemed distracted and shaken. Eventually, Mike opened up about the dream he had, about drowning for weeks while the Gray Man watched. Over the next couple weeks, Mike's health appeared to start deteriorating, and the dream seemed to have gotten worse. Eventually, Mike was switched to private learning after too many outbursts. As time passed, the author moved on and made new friends. It was around this time that a new graffitiist appeared, tagging walls with Japanese words and phrases. One night while coming home, the author saw Mike in an alleyway under a half-completed graffiti tag. The dreams had gotten even worse for Mike, not even being able to escape them when he was awake. The author woke up in the middle of the night to Mike standing in the corner of his room. Mike told him to delete everything that linked him to the Gray Man, which she did, except for the actual game. The author decided to play the game to see if there was anything wrong with it. Continuing from Mike's file, he noted strangely that the Gray Man had disappeared. That night, the author had a dream, not about the Gray Man though, but of his friend Mike. Mike disappeared after that night, and the author even started his own file in the game, where he encountered the Gray Man, but nothing happened. A few weeks later, the police found Mike's body, with forensics determining that he had bludgeoned himself to death with a rock. The author still dreams about him sometimes.
Do you remember the Happy Mask salesman from both Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask? Happiness for Sale is a story that tells of an encounter that a young boy had with the salesman when he'd first moved to his town. The boy encountered him one day as he was walking through town. He noticed the large sack on his back, the thin frame of the man, and his thinning red hair. The most striking part of his appearance, though, was his almost inhumanly big smile. The man's smile extended from ear to ear, and that creeped the boy out. Even if he was put off by the man's demeanor, he still wanted to know more about him. The man approached him and he was paralyzed with fear. A long moment passed before the man would turn and leave, and as he did, the boy noticed his large sack had masks all along it. The boy spent the night not being able to sleep. All he could think about was his encounter with the man with the masks. Every time he would close his eyes, all he would see was that man's smile. No, he wasn't a man, he was a demon in the skin of a man. The next day, the boy decided he needed to confront the man and find out what he really was. After eating breakfast, he ran to the square where he first encountered the man and found that the empty building in town now had a crowd around it. At the center of the crowd is where he stood, the man with the smile that sent shivers down the boy's spine. The Happy Mask salesman stood next to a sign and spoke of his new shop. The sign next to the demon said, "Happy Mask Shop. Happiness is just a mask away." The boy shuddered but decided his curiosity must be sated. He went into the shop once the majority of the group had gone. Inside, he found the mask salesman giving his mask to two different people, a woman and a child. Both of them had glossy looks in their eyes, but took the mask before walking out of the shop. It was just the Happy Mask salesman and the boy now. He stood and asked him a question, but got no response. The man stood like he was waiting for something else to be said. A few moments later, another child walked into the shop. He walked right up to the Happy Mask salesman and put his hands out like he was waiting for a mask. The man looked down at the boy and then began to glare. There was a moment of fear from the boy before the Happy Mask salesman grabbed him by the throat. He lifted the boy into the air and then opened his mouth. A crackling sound could be heard as his jaws unhinged and his mouth grew wide enough to swallow the boy. The Happy Mask salesman began to put the boy in his mouth. The boy began kicking and screaming, but to no avail. The boy was entirely inside the mask salesman's mouth now. The man brought his hands to his mouth and started to form the flesh of the child. A moment later, he had turned the child into a mask. He pulled the mask from his mouth and outstretched his hand to the boy, who was now cowering in the corner. "Do you want a mask, my boy?" The boy was in tears, but he managed enough strength to run from the building. He ran and didn't stop until he got home. There he sat in his room crying and rocking back and forth. The boy the next day went out into town and saw that the shop was now closed, like it had never existed in the first place. He then proceeds to warn everyone of this demon and to avoid him if you ever see him. The Happy Mask salesman has been a popular recurring character in a lot of creepypastas. It's easy to see why when you can see how terrifying he can be, especially in Majora's Mask. Two friends are talking about getting games for their 3DSs. The author asks his friend Owen if he picked up the new Smash game yet, and he replies no, that he got Tamagotchi Life instead. He was a little upset with Owen, as he wanted them to play games together, but got over it as he saw how fun the game looked and figured Smash would still be a fun game by himself. Later, Owen was telling the author about how the game lets you make funny songs sung by the characters on the island. They let you change the lyrics and they can be whatever you want them to be. Owen was worried about one thing though. When he started the game, instead of making his Mii the main character, the game already had someone as the main character. There was a Mii named Mr. Happy already on the island. Mr. Happy had his own song, one that Owen didn't make for him either. It was a morbid song about how everyone should die happy. The lyrics made them both laugh, even if it was a bit uncomfortable. A few days later, the author got a phone call from Jenny, Owen's wife. She was crying into the phone and he wasn't sure what was wrong. She told him how Owen had jumped off a bridge near their house. The author was shocked. His best friend was dead. Not only that, but he was at the best time of his life. He had beaten the drugs with the alcohol addiction and came out a stronger person. To hear that, even in the happiest moments of his life, that he was now gone, it broke him. A strange email appeared in the author's inbox. It was from Owen, but that wouldn't be possible. The email included a video file. Playing it, he saw Mr. Happy dancing and singing his song, the one that Owen had told him about. The lyrics, which were funny when they first heard them together, now took on a creepy undertone. It made his whole body freeze up. The song trudged up all of the memories of Owen. Later, when the author was playing his own copy of Tomodachi Life, a new islander had moved in. It was Mr. Happy, just as he was in Owen's game. Same face, same voice, and same creepy song available to him. Not long after, the author found himself playing the game to find out more about Mr. Happy. Some of his Miis had started to die. When he would visit their apartments, all it said is that they had committed suicide. After a while, the author started to see all of his Miis following the same fate, until it was his Mii's turn. He wasn't sad though. He'd already accepted it. There was no reason for him to not die happy. A man sends a letter to his friend Nick. Nick had to move away, but before he did, Nick let him download his entire game library from his computer. The games were all pirated and needed to be cracked before they could be played. Most of the games could be cracked pretty simply, but a few couldn't be broken so easily. After the author searched the internet for a solution for a while, he stumbled across a Japanese program. The program was titled Shikami no Tenjin. The program was perfect for cracking the games and making them playable. The program worked incredibly well, but came with a weird warning. It read, "Files will be unknown format. Rename.iso and mount external. Do not try to run." The author followed this warning, which made the games work fine. He was able to play through a ton of games that he would have missed out on otherwise. He played Skyrim, Civilization, and StarCraft 2. He did wonder though what would happen if he ran the files before mounting them. The first game he tried to run without mounting was Portal 2. The game started mostly normally until he got to that title screen. Portal 2 looked darker. Shell's body was strewn across the ground with her body crumpled in an unnatural way. After starting the game, the author noted how much darker in tone the game was and how there was a layer of fog covering the ground in every level. This happened in every game he tried to run in this unknown format. Serious Sam HD was darker and bloodier, Civ 6 had some questionable content added to it. When the author went back and mounted the games as ISO, they ran perfectly again. It would only happen when the games were run in the unknown format. This meant that the program itself was somehow corrupting these games. The author then ran a movie through the program. It ran the movie mostly normally, but eventually the movie started to show darker imagery in the background, mainly of a violent nature. The author deleted the files from his computer and set out, as he put it, to show the world how truly dark a place it can be. The story ends with Nick getting a letter from his friend and explaining that his friend was found hiding in a bunker. He had committed several acts of violence and was hiding away with stuff to make bombs and poisons.
Glitches in video games go together like peanut butter and jelly. And they can range from the absurd to the downright creepy. The Cathedral is one such glitch, found in Kingdom Hearts. The glitch works something like this. At the beginning of the game, when you're in Sora's dream on the stained glass floor, if you die in the center of Snow White's apple instead of simply restarting before the bell, you will be transported to another cathedral. But instead of the happy music that is generally there, all you will hear is static. The stained glass floors have also changed. The Snow White one that you start on now features a dead Snow White, with blood leaking out of her eyes, ears, and mouth. The evil queen is depicted with her bloody heart in her hands. The rest of the floors appeared to have also changed, into warped versions of the original stories, with visuals such as Beast eating Belle, Cinderella being sold into slavery, and the decomposing body of Sleeping Beauty. When you get to actually fighting Heartless, they have changed as well, now standing taller than Sora, featuring claws and have yellow eyes with red irises. They can also only be defeated if the player chose the sword. For this reason, not many people have gotten past this point of the glitch, with most of them having reset the game to play the actual game. But for the dedicated few who sought to see it through to the end, they were greeted with a fight against the giant Sora Heartless. He too has changed. The heart-shaped hole in his chest is gone and his eyes are now red. I called it a fight, but honestly it's anything but. As soon as the battle starts, he immediately grabs you, and the black tendrils begin to enter Sora's face, before the screen goes black and all you can hear is Sora's screams, and weird whispers, with the words "Game Over" flashing on the screen. Players who restarted the game at this point were only greeted with a black screen and whispering. They have also reported hearing whispers when they are alone, along with seeing red eyes in the darkness. The developers of the game have denied the existence of this glitch, writing it off as people with deranged sense of humor making things up. However, there was one designer who only helped in the beginning of the game, who did not appear in the credits of the final game. His name was Akane Hoyotami, and as stated earlier, he only worked on the beginning of the game, leaving after his section of the game was done. After he left, he reported seeing creatures following him, creatures with red eyes and yellow irises. These reports were ignored by the police as the ravings of a madman. Shortly after, he was found dead in his house. His body looked like it was cut up with sharp nails. His neighbor reported hearing him the night before screaming about eyes and whispering.
Nintendo had a drought in Super Mario platform games. From the years of 1997 to 2005, there wasn't a single new Super Mario platformer released. The sales of the N64 and GameCube were both far behind Sony's PlayStation and its gritty, dark, and realistic games. Nintendo thought that this is where the medium was headed. The thought then became to take Mario, their flagship franchise, in a similar direction. The next Mario game would be darker, grittier, and more realistic. Of course, internal strife in the company with how far to take the concept was a problem early on. The game was available as a demo on the Wii Homebrew channel, but was later removed. The author recounts his time playing the game. Super Mario 128 was noticeably darker than any previous Mario game, which was the new direction that Nintendo thought gaming as a whole was headed. It starts off with Princess Peach being taken as usual, but this time the note from Bowser was a little more sinister. He threatened to kill Peach if Mario were to pursue them, and that his death would follow. The game was very unfinished. There were no enemies, just platforms that Mario could jump on. Mario's jumping ability was very limited in this game. He could jump from platform to platform, but he seemed to jump just a little lower and didn't make the same sounds as he did so. Finally, the author spotted a single Toad on a platform. When he talked to him, Toad just said that he hated Mario, and that everyone was better off without him. This was so striking, as the Toads seemed to love Mario before. After a while of jumping aimlessly from platform to platform, a city appeared beneath Mario. It looked like an actual city with actual people in it, not something seen in a Mario game before. The buildings looked neglected but realistic all the same. Once Mario was in the city, the author could see all the people looking at him with disgust and anger in their eyes, as if Mario had somehow ruined their lives. They all slowly started to leave the area where Mario stood until they were all gone and the city seemed empty. After some walking around, Mario came upon a lone house. It seemed to be a level, and after entering did the name appear, the House of Torn Memories. It was a level of sorts. Inside were normal objects you'd find in any house, but also had a broken lamp and old rotting food. There were a set of stairs leading downwards into a basement. The author took Mario in that direction. In the basement was a dilapidated couch with two skeletons of what looked to be children sitting on it. The couch sat in front of an old and broken TV. A creepy version of Bowser broke through the floor and stared at Mario. He said that Mario could save the princess if he gave his own life for hers. Mario nodded and Bowser pierced his chest with his elongated claws. The story ends with Mario walking through a world that seemed like the afterlife. He walked aimlessly until he found a single gravestone. The gravestone had a single word written on it. Innocence.
A huge Touhou fan, the player decided to torrent the game as they were only available in Japan, though oddly enough only one person had torrented the game before him. Opening the game, nothing was out of the ordinary. Starting the game, the player blasted his way through the first boss, a husky blonde woman. When he started the second level, the text, "Do you understand me now?" appeared. The player ignored it and proceeded through the second level, struggling to beat the second boss, a woman with glowing eyes and a dark aura. At the beginning of the third stage, the text, "Are you here to play with me?" appeared, and he again ignored the text. This level was a lot harder, with the boss integrated into the level itself. This boss was a blonde Oni woman. The player lost all of his lives here. After his defeat, the player decided to get an English patch to better understand the game. When you returned to the game, Remiru now had a frown on her face, and when he got back to the first boss, it said, "Have you come to harm me again?" The boss now sported cuts and bruises across her body. During the fight, she would simply try to run away from the player. Before he began the second level, the text, "I think she deserved it too," appeared from a person that introduced herself as Sealed Rose, who seemed to wait for a response, but none came from Remiru. Defeating the second boss, the player moved to the third stage, and Sealed Rose spoke again. "Why won't you speak to me?" The player figured she wasn't talking to Remiru, she was talking to them. Plugging in the headset, he said hello to Rose. Rose again asked why he hadn't responded until now. The player lied to her, and told her he was unable to until now. She seemed to pick up on the lie, and became hostile. Completing the third level, he continued to level 4. "Don't go just yet" appeared on the screen before he began the level, though it was unclear who said this. The boss to this level was a young girl, who told the players he must leave. The player assumed she was Sealed Rose and began asking questions, but all she said was, "You must leave now, she has suffered enough," before she introduced herself as Satoshi Komuji. Defeating Satoshi, he moved on to level 5, with the text, "Suffer as I did," showing up. This level was a huge departure from the regular Touhou maps. The background was a dark red field with patches of fire, and the enemies were ghosts that screamed in pain when they were shot. Getting to the end, he was greeted by the horrifying boss, a cat. Upon defeating the cat, Sealed Rose showed up once again, with the dialogue, "Hurry to me." Then, "You shall receive eternal torture" appeared, before the player was transported to a new level. This level was a violent, fiery landscape with magma flowing over it. Burning bodies were strewn across the area, being shoveled into the fire by half-animal creatures. The boss to this level was a giant raven, who spouted some nonsense about serving a new master. Managing to ink out a victory, the player ignored the end credits. Tired, he decided to go to sleep, except he couldn't get out of his chair. The screen flashed, and the text, "Leaving so soon" appeared, before a small white-haired witch appeared, Scarlet Rose. Remiru once again had dialogue, meaning the player could talk. He asked, why was she doing this? She responded by telling him she had read the minds of humans, and deemed them selfish beings, who deserved destruction, before revealing who she really was, Kyoshi Komuji. The boss battle began, but it had a small twist. The player could feel the pain of his character. The fight wasn't going well, with the boss becoming invulnerable. Before the boss could finish him off though, he was sucked into a black hole, the message "Supernatural Border" flashing onto the screen. The battle began once again. This time though, the boss could no longer hurt him. Dispatching of the boss, the player spoke, not really expecting an answer. "Who are you?" he asked. A sweet voice answered him, a voice that came from him. "The one behind the spiriting away. The border is mine."
Plants vs. Zombies is a pretty simple and family-friendly game. The author, having heard it was a good game, decided he wanted to find a copy. He ends up pirating it and finds a torrent with only one seeder. The download takes a while, but it does eventually finish downloading. When it was done, the file for some reason had a different name. Instead of being Plants vs. Zombies.exe for the executable, it was Deadplants.exe. The other files seemed normal, so the author went ahead and started the game. The first difference they noted was the change in mood of the game. It seemed darker, like it was modified to be more creepy. The stages were also much harder, even the starting ones. The night levels took on a much darker gloom. Instead of a clear night sky, they were now covered with clouds. These levels were especially hard. The author also mentions at this point that the music, which started in a pitch higher than usual, was slowly raising in pitch after each level. Eventually the author got to the roof levels, and this is where the biggest changes to the game took place. The level was noticeably dimmer. The plants, when they would die and get replaced, would be replaced by grotesque versions of the usual plants. It became obvious to the author what was going on. The plants were returning as the ones that had been eaten by the zombies. They were mutated, dead plants. The screen grew too dark for the author to play anymore, and he heard the familiar sound of the zombies breaking into the house. A loud scream rang out of his game that lasted for 7 seconds before the game shut off. Anytime the author tries to reopen the game, an unreadable error message pops up on the screen. The author has vowed never to pirate a game again, as he can't get that scream out of his dreams.
If you knew about stories of haunted cartridges and hacked games, would you play a mysterious version of a game you found in the trash? The author would, as we see in this story. The author would, as we see when he opens the game, finds the menu changed to Strangled Red, and continues to play the game. The author finds when he tries to continue from the last save file, the game doesn't let him. All he gets is a voice saying no. So he starts a new game. But unlike in the normal Red version, his character's name has already been chosen, Steven. The rival, who's also his brother's name, is Mike. And finally, he had a level 5 Charmander named Mickey. The story had also been changed. He is no longer Red, but a separate character with relationships to the people of Pallet Town. Setting out on his journey, the author quickly finds that his Charmander Mickey is far stronger than a normal Charmander. It isn't affected by its usual weaknesses. It did more damage, and even evolves into a Charizard at level 25. When the author arrives at Lavender Town, he notices that Team Rocket isn't there, and Steven refuses to go into Pokemon Tower, saying he has no reason to be there. Progressing through the rest of the game with ease, the author gets to the champion fight with his brother, and defeats him. Then the screen goes white. When the screen comes back, the brothers are in their room, where Mike is asking Steven to trade Mickey to him, so they can both finish their Pokédexes. The author is reluctant, but eventually says yes. During the trade, though, the game freezes, and he's forced to restart it. When the menu popped back up, he noted that there was no longer a Charizard, and he could only continue. When he clicked to continue, the words 1 year later popped up on the screen, and the game opened with Steven standing in front of a tombstone in Pokemon Tower. His sprite had changed from a confident young boy to a depressed one. His hair splayed in front of his face. Music played, but it wasn't the Pokemon Tower theme, and Steven no longer had anything on him. It appears that Mickey had died in the trade, and Steven had given up on everything. Leaving the tower, he was greeted by NPCs offering up their condolences. Heading back to Pallet Town, it seemed to be the same thing with the people he grew up with. Them offering up condolences, and their brother even apologizing for what happened. That night, Steven talks about doing it, which confuses the author, having no idea what it is. Going out into the water, the author encounters missing number, and catches it. But strangely enough, it isn't a Pokemon, it is an item. He then proceeds to go back to Pokemon Tower, and stands above Mickey's grave. He uses the item and receives the Pokemon. The game then took away the author's control, leaving him unable to check what the Pokemon was. The music getting more and more distorted with each town he passed through, before eventually just sounding like demonic rumbling. When he made it to Pallet Town, he went directly to his room, and just stood in front of his brother's bed, making no more moves. It was so still that the author thought the game froze. Then the author proceeded to check his Pokemon trainer card again. He found that his name had been changed to some deformed version of Steven, and the sprite now bore a wide white grin. Trying to save the game, the words "nothing can be saved now" appeared, where a snap occurred, and the game shut itself off. Turning it back on, he was greeted by the same sight as when he originally opened the game. A trainer with a Charizard, and an overview of Pallet Town with Steven's house surrounded by grass. Clicking continue, the game just said, no.
Zombreon is the story of a guy who decided to try a beta version of Pokemon Gold on the Game Boy Color. The author had heard from a friend that there were supposed to be 2 more evolutions added to Eevee in Pokemon Gold and Silver, but they were dropped from the game. The author, being unconvinced but very interested, decided to try the game by getting his hands on a beta version of Pokemon Gold. The first few he found didn't really work or were just normal versions of the game. Finally, the author found the beta ROM he was looking for, and booting it up, everything seemed pretty normal. The first thing the author did was try and find ways to evolve Eevee into either of the other forms. The 2 forms were Poison and Ghost type. The author decided the easiest way to do this would be just to play the game through and see if he could figure it out along the way. He ended up finishing the game, beating the Elite Four, and conquering Kanto. Even after all of that, he was no closer to finding out how to evolve Eevee. As for the game itself, being a beta, a few things were different. Some of the locations, dialogue, and NPC locations had changed, but overall it was pretty similar. Also, a few Pokemon were missing from the game, including Dunsparce. The author decided he might need some help locating the item required, and so he found someone online who said they could write a code that would give him all the items. After a while, the person he'd met online delivered and gave him the code. The code worked, and now he had access to every item in the game. He found a weird item that he'd been missing. It was called Toxic Stone, which probably was how he would evolve Eevee into the Poison type. After trying, the author got no results. A message would pop up and say it has no effect. The author tried several different methods, but every time he was met with the same message. As a last-ditch effort, he decided to find every NPC and talk to them to see if they would give him any useful information. One NPC finally told him the answer he needed. Did you know there's a stone that can evolve a Pokemon after it's fainted? That's what he said, and it was the final piece to the Poison evolution puzzle that the author had been looking for. Once Eevee had fainted from a battle, the author applied the stone. Eevee started to evolve. Finally, after all the author's searching, it was real. His friend had been telling the truth, and there were more evolutions. After the evolution screen ended, a green Eevee missing parts of his body appeared on the screen. It didn't look much different except for the palette swap. The missing ear made it look a little weird though. Eevee had also learned a new move, Zombite. The author decided he would try out his new move and went to find a battle. The first Pokemon the author encountered was a wild Sentret. The battle started and the author decided to try out the new move, Zombite. After using it, the Pokemon was defeated instantly, and then the game asked for him to name the Sentret. The Pokemon was then sent to the author's PC and he was very confused. The game registered him catching the wild Pokemon for some reason. The author decided he needed to try this on a trainer to see what would happen. The author encountered a trainer and immediately used the move on his Pokemon. The Pokemon was defeated immediately and the trainer yelled at the author, "What did you do to my Pokemon?" The battle ended and when the game returned to the world, the trainer was gone. All the trainers in the area were gone, actually. The author then went to a Pokemon Center and checked his PC. All of the Pokemon in there were the same green as Zombreon. After exiting out of the PC, he saw the same trainer that he'd fought before coming here. The man yelled at the author again before a battle started with a different trainer. The trainer used an Arcanine, but the battle ended the exact same as the last one had. Zombreon used Zombite and immediately won the battle. The author flew to Goldenrod City and was met with an empty city. He walked around and tried to enter the buildings, but they were all locked. Finally, he went to the Pokemon Center and was able to go inside. It was empty as well, save for the radio on the counter. A strange message was playing over the radio. Beware of strange Pokemon. Trainers from the Kanto region have been reporting strange green Pokemon attacking and infecting other Pokemon and trainers. Remain indoors and avoid all contact with strange Pokemon and people. Followed by, I'm so lonely. Following this, a group of angry NPCs would try and fight the author, but Zombreon was too strong. After the battle, Zombreon left its Pokeball and ran free, attacking the Pokemon and their trainers. The Pokemon turned green, but any NPC that was touched would simply disappear. The author went back to the PC to get another flying Pokemon, but wasn't able to pull one out. The only option available to him was to release all the Zomb Pokemon. Doing so would destroy the Pokemon world. The city was on fire outside and most of the buildings were now boarded up. The author returned to the player's hometown to be met by a professor at the lab. He had developed a cure and started a battle with the player. The new ability, known as Cure, was easily working against the author's team. The fight nearly ended as Zombreon came out as the last Pokemon. Cure was used, but Zombreon used Struggle and both Pokemon were defeated. The professor left immediately after the battle and a loud bang could be heard from outside of the building. The author returned to his home and found his mom was inside. He clicked on her and the only thing that the game said was, "It's Mom, she's not moving." The game then ended with a loud beep and then the emulator froze. Trying to run the game again would freeze the emulator. In Halo Beta, the author decides he needs to get a new Xbox after his breaks, so rather than buying one on Amazon, the safer option, he buys one from eBay. The seller claims to be an ex-member of Bungie just looking to sell an old unit they were given for free by Microsoft. Of course, the author buys it and anxiously awaits his new console. It arrives and he is excited to play whatever gems might have been left on the console. The author searched through the save files but didn't find anything unusual. That was until he got to a file titled Halo Beta. It was exactly what he was looking for, an unreleased beta for one of his favorite games. It was even ready to be played and everything. The author tapped the play button and the game started up. Everything seemed normal. All of the same levels were available on the level select screen, the multiplayer maps were exactly the same, and the menu didn't appear any different. The author started a new game on Heroic and jumped in on the first level. The first difference came about when he started killing Marines on the Pillars of Autumn at the start of the game. Instead of there being invincible Marines or a game over, the game continues but you've killed everyone. You'll still have to escape the vessel and kill both Marines and Covenant on your way out. The rest of the opening of the game plays out like an evil run. Master Chief kills more Marines, doesn't help those around him, and constantly does the wrong thing. This leads to some interesting dialogue between Master Chief and Cortana, who is still partnering up with him for some reason. Eventually Chief will get to the part with the Flood, and instead of being able to fend them off, will actually get killed by them and then turned into one. They burrow into his chest like the scene in Alien in reverse, and he now leads the Flood. The Flood begins their invasion of Earth, with Chief at the front. They start to take over and control the populace of Earth, including the Marines who came to stop them. The game ends with Cortana activating the Halo ring along with Sergeant Johnson. All 7 Halo rings start up and the game zooms in on Cortana's face. The galaxy now has been cleansed of all organic life.
The internet has really made sharing video games a lot easier. With just a simple button press, you can share what you are playing with the world. But things were not always so easy a generation ago. People would have to meet face to face to trade games with other like-minded people. During such meetings, would-be programmers would trade games that they had made, themselves, to get their game around. The good ones would find themselves in the collection of aficionados across the country. Pale Luna was not amongst these games, never making it out of the San Francisco area. All known copies have been long disposed of. All computers that ever ran the game now detritus, buried under layers of Philoth and polystyrene. The reason for this being its rather obtruse design. A text-based adventure, Pale Luna would open up on a blank screen, except for the text, "You are in a dark room. Moonlight shines through the window. There is gold in the corner, along with a shovel and rope. There is a door to the east, command." The game was described as unplayable, with the game only accepting a few commands, after which the player would be presented with the following: reap your rewards. Pale Luna smiles at you. Then the game would give you the option of going in one of 3 directions, with only one of the directions being the correct one. If you went in the wrong direction, the game would freeze, forcing you to hard reset your computer. But even if you did go in the right direction, the game would just give you the same text with different directions to go in. Most people only got a couple screens in before deciding it wasn't worth the time, and threw it away. That was until a man named Michael Nevins decided that there was probably more to Pale Luna than met the eye, and after a lot of resetting his computer, he finally got new text. Pale Luna smiles wide. There are no paths. Pale Luna smiles wide. The ground is soft. Pale Luna smiles wide. Here, command. After more trial and error, he got the final screen, which read, "Congratulations, 40.24248-121.4434. Figuring that the numbers were coordinates, Michael armed himself with a map, compass, and a shovel, and set out. The coordinates led him to a forest near Lassen Volcanic Park. Following a path, noting that each turn corresponded with a turn from the game, at the end of the trail he found some uneven dirt. Excited, Neville began digging, though what he would find shook Nevins to his core, as he unearthed not treasure but the badly decomposed skull of a blonde-haired girl. Reporting it to the authorities, the school was identified as Karen Paulinson, an 11-year-old who went missing a year and a half prior. They tried to track down the original programmer, but only met dead ends. The rest of Karen's body was never found. Summer camps, those horrible places that your parents force you to go because they don't want to deal with you for the summer. Usually these camps just consist of stupid campfire games and getting bitten by bugs. What if the camp you got sent to ended up being a hellhole? The terrible secret of Animal Crossing is a tale of one such occurrence. Billy was an 8-year-old child who was sent to a summer camp by the name of Animal Crossing. A camp he's never heard of, but it was cheap and they were broke. The camp even sent them their own cabbie, so after tossing his suitcase in the back, he was on his way. The ride over was mostly uneventful, with the only thing keeping him awake the occasional small talk from the driver, which usually consisted of some sarcastic remarks about the camp. When he arrived, the cabbie drove off before he could grab his suitcase. So now here he was, at a strange camp with nothing but the clothes on his back. Heading into the check-in station, Billy was greeted by the strange sight of a giant pelican behind the counter. Billy figured that was some weird gimmick that the camp did. Talking to the pelican, he was informed that Tom Nook had a special interest in setting up his cabin. Throughout her little speech, Billy noted how rehearsed it sounded. When he arrived at his home, he was shocked at what he was given. There was nothing in it aside from some cardboard and a radio that barely worked. Furious, he made for the admissions office, but before he could really get anywhere, he was chased down by a man in a raccoon costume, Tom Nook. Nook informed him of his purchase of the shack and how he owes him money, then forces him into a part-time job at his shop. After his first forced work day, Billy notices that he's the only camper. Starting to panic, Billy runs for the gates of the camps, but finds they are blocked by human-sized guard dogs. Begging the guard on the right to let him out, the guard doesn't budge, just telling him that he should be working his part-time job. Billy comes to the conclusion that everybody here is a part of this. He realizes that he is trapped. Throughout the next week, Billy is forced to work from sun up to sundown for Nook, with only a promise to be paid. With only a few oranges to eat, he begins to starve. Then finally he is given the chance to send for help when Tom has him send a letter to a resident. Instead, Billy tries to send a letter to his mother, telling her what is going on. It unfortunately doesn't work out how Billy wants it, as when he gets the letter back from his mother, it's clearly not from her. More days go by without being paid, and with no pay means no way to pay off his debt. One day, a new resident shows up. His name is Pacm. Billy winds up befriending this new resident, as unlike the other residents, he doesn't act like a zombie, and isn't an asshole to him. Feeling like he can confide in Pacm, he secretly sends him a letter at night explaining everything. Unfortunately, the next day it seems Pacm has changed, acting the same as other residents. After this interaction, he is waved over by the mayor, who tells him that the mayor is always watching. Billy comes to the realization that all of this is being coordinated by Nook, and that he can only rely on himself. Confronting Nook the next day, he is laid off as Nook no longer has work for him. Forced to find a way to escape, Billy comes up with a list of things he needs to do to escape. While biding his time, he starts to dig up fossils to sell to Nook. With the money, or should I say bells, he buys a costume to secretly fish, to stock up on food for his escape. While he's digging up fossil, he winds up finding some weird statue, which he finds himself unnaturally curious about. After a few months, Billy manages to pay off his debt to Nook, which he uses to upgrade his shop. While at the shop, Tom forces Billy to upgrade his house, forcing him back into debt, so he goes back to digging up fossils and G-roids, which he has become obsessed with. Residents come and go for no reason. One day, Billy sees a bottle floating in the sky. Following it, he finds a letter in the bottle from another trapped resident by the name of Penny. After a few days of sending messages back and forth, including maps of their camps, which are identical, Billy gets the idea to send messages in different directions, to see how many people are trapped here. The next day, messages come flooding in, from kids who have been here ranging from a few weeks to years. They also send maps of their island Billy, and just like Penny's, it is identical to his. That night, Billy goes behind the museum and puts together the maps. What he finds brings him to his knees. They are on an island. They are all stuck on an island. Billy forms another plan to steal a boat to escape. The first thing they need to do is monitor Nook to see how he gets from one camp to another. So Billy stakes out Nook's store to wait for him. Hours go by and nothing happens. Nook never comes out of his store. At around 3 AM, sirens start to blare and the villagers start to file out of their houses. Billy tries to find out what was going on, but the villagers would only tell him to go back to bed. The next morning, he gets another letter from Penny. The blares from last night were because Penny broke into Nook's shop, found some secret tunnels, and then broke into Nook's house. She even managed to steal his personal notebook, which she sent his way. Returning to his house, he sits down and reads it. The island was originally meant to be a getaway island for rich people, a joint business venture between Nook and KK Slider. Halfway through construction, they started to find the G-Roid statues, and they began to infect the workers. The workers began fighting with each other over them. KK Slider tried to convince Nook that they should abandon this venture, but Nook didn't listen. He was being consumed by the G-Roids. He even winds up locking KK Slider up. Eventually, the journal entries start to get rambly and illegible. Then 7 years later, they are legible again, but there's something off about them. They talk about needing more, and about young ones crossing faster. Everything clicks for Billy. Nook didn't start as a raccoon, he was turned into one by the G-Roids. It takes time to turn them into animals though, and that's what the pointless activities are for. They're meant to distract them, until they turn. Before he really has time to process this, the animals break down his door, drag him out of his house, and proceed to beat him. The next morning he wakes up bandaged, bruised, and missing an eye. Over the next week he tries to get in contact with Penny, or any other kids, but gets nothing, until a balloon floats by. Shooting it down, he receives his final letter from Billy. I've been a bad girl. You probably think I'm innocent, but I'm not, and I will tell you why. I screamed for 3 days and they took my tongue. I threw balls to the sea and they took my arm. But worst of all, I stole what was not mine and lied about it. So you see, I'm not innocent. I hope you will make better choices, Billy. I sent you my final gift. I don't need it anymore. Inside the box, he found a key. Nook's key. Heading to Nook's shop, which was suspiciously locked during the day. Entering the shop, he quickly found a secret passage. Armed with a lantern and an axe, he made his way through the tunnel. Not too far into the passage, he came across Nook. Enraged, he demanded to know where Penny was before charging Nook with the axe, who just let it happen. The axe took a chunk out of his leg, causing him to topple over. Then Tom explained everything to Billy. It turns out Tom was Penny the entire time. Well, kinda. See, Penny is Tom's wife, who had terminal illness, who when she crossed over never recovered from the insanity it caused. She's been controlling the island through fear, and kidnapping children to transform into animals, to harvest to keep herself alive. After telling Billy all of this, Tom kills himself. With the realization that it was Tom that was really his only friend, Billy resolves himself to kill Penny. Arriving at Penny's mansion, he finds the back door unlocked. Heading into the house, he makes his way to Penny's room. The door creaks as he enters, and Penny mistakes him for Tom. Tom, dear, is that you? Did you bring the boy I told you to fetch? Did you have to hurt him? Turning towards him, he was met with a face that appears to be falling apart, and eyes so malicious he almost fainted. He also notes that one of her eyes is his. Before he can kill her, he's apprehended by some dog guards, and brought before a crowd. The other children appear to be there as well. Penny demands to know which of the children stole her belongings. Billy tries to take the blame for it, but she doesn't believe him, and then she has the dogs take one of the children up to her room for her. The dogs reluctantly do so. There's some screaming, then silence. Penny comes to the balcony with Harold's arm waving around. Look! Harold's waving goodbye to you all! She once more demands to know who stole it. Billy doesn't get a chance to say anything before another child steps forward and takes the blame. His name is Philip. He is escorted into the house by the dogs. Managing to break free from the guards, he follows after Philip. Turning the corner, Billy is greeted by the scene of Penny hovering over the bloody body of Philip. But it appears he didn't go quietly, as Penny has a gash in her side that is oozing crimson. Too distracted to notice the guard behind him, Billy is knocked to the ground, with Tom's key coming out. Upon seeing the key, Penny demands to know how he got it. Dragging him into the house, she slams him against the wall, demanding one thing. Where is Tom? Why isn't he here? Billy once again tells her that Tom is dead, but this time goes a step further, explaining why. He killed himself because he couldn't stand the thought of having to live one more minute with a hideous fail of nature like you. He'd rather be dead than to have to wake up every morning next to a monster. After a vicious fight, Billy finally kills Penny. Afterward, a helicopter shows up and saves the children. The story ends with a 30-year-old Billy explaining that he was immune to whatever caused the turning, and that his blood was used to develop a cure to help the other infected children. There's also a much darker alternate ending, but we'll save that for another time.
Sad Satan isn't really a creepypasta, not in the most literal sense. It's a game that was created and downloaded through the deep web. The game itself isn't anything special, just a walking simulator with creepy noises and flashing lights. No, Sad Satan isn't really a game at all. But then why am I talking about it? Sad Satan is the first deep web horror game, and it was the first seen on an obscure horror channel called Obscure Horror Corner. The original game was played by tons of top horror creators back when it was first discovered, but aside from flashing gore images that would pop up through the playthrough, there wasn't much to talk about. That was until an anonymous post was made on 4chan claiming that the version everyone played wasn't the real version of the game. Everyone waited in anticipation as the OP said they would post a link for everyone to download. The link was dropped and the game download ruined a bunch of people's PCs. This led to everyone thinking it was a virus and not a game at all, except that wasn't the case. The virus was hiding a game, the real version of Sad Satan. The real version of the game was essentially the same thing, but it had real gore images and some other illegal imagery that I'm not going to name in this video. This version was grotesque and edgy beyond reason. The game would get a clean version made available to the Reddit community, but the gross illegal imagery still remains in the dirty version as it is referred to. The clean version has some random images that replace the bad stuff, but it's still not a very good game. The man believed to be behind the game is thankfully behind bars, which hopefully he remains. As for the game, you can still download the clean version, but it's really nothing special. The game never was. Being a child of the 90s, there were a lot of vague PC games that hardly anyone knew about. The author describes his time playing PC games in his parents' basement as a child. He would wake up early and jump on his parents' PC to play all sorts of games as the PC was strong enough to play most anything that was available at the time. The author does recall a game that he just can't remember the name of. He used to play it all the time but just couldn't remember the name, which is funny because he could remember everything else about the game. The game has you playing as a kid with your dog. The kid and the dog are approaching a decrepit-looking castle together. The dog then runs off, chasing a raven through a hole in the gate of the castle. The boy then chases after the dog, and the game begins. The game had tank control, so you moved like Lara Croft in the original Tomb Raider. The game was fully 3D and even had pre-rendered cutscenes. The author does note that even for the 90s, the pre-rendered cutscenes looked janky and unusual. The boy makes his way into the castle eventually, following a dark stone path. The grass around the stones looks dead and the gates to the castle are rusted and decaying. There was no music, just the sound of the wind blowing in the boy's footsteps. As the boy entered the castle through the garden, he was met with his first enemy. A giant stone statue loomed in front of the entrance. The author moved the boy trying to get past him, but was treated to one of the game's many death animations. The boy was hit so hard by the hand of the stone statue that his neck snapped. The sound was very real sounding, and was made even more disturbing by the lack of music. The game had several more death scenes like this one involving a gargoyle that breathes fire, and another by a suit of armor with a lance impaling the boy. These scenes were so dark, but there was never any blood involved, just the gruesome death of this boy. The interior of the castle was very dark and musty. Once again, the lack of music gave the castle a far eerier feeling. The sounds of chains rattling somewhere in the building also sent shivers down the author's spine. The author got to the graveyard section and noted that this is the last area he played in the game. He couldn't ever figure out the puzzle to progress. There were only 2 tombstones that he could interact with. One of the tombstones had listed every death the boy had endured, which was a lot since he wasn't very good at the game. The second tombstone had the name of the author on it. The date of the death was the date of the day he was playing the game. This scared him enough to drop the game entirely, and he hasn't touched it since. The author, thinking back on it, considers the possibility that the game has read the PC's name, and that's how he was able to put it on the tombstone. But if that were the case, it wouldn't be his name on the tombstone.
One day, the author decided he wanted to play Pokemon Blue again, but not an emulated version, so he went out and bought a copy. Popping the game in, he started his Pokemon journey with Squirtle. But not too far into the game, he ran into something strange, Mewtwo, a level 70 Mewtwo, who wiped out his entire team. Blacking out, he spawned back at the Pokemon Center, but without his Pokemon, except Squirtle. They had been wiped out. Frustrated, the author reset from his last save, but no good, they were still gone. Worse still, the starter was reverted back to level 5. The author was tempted to restart from the beginning, but decided against it, not wanting to redo the Viridian Forest. As he pushed through the game, getting wiped out by Mewtwo continuously, forcing him to retrain Pokemon over and over again, he eventually made it to Lavender Town, where he was pulled into a battle with Mew, who he was able to catch. who, like his starter, didn't disappear after fainting, but unlike his starter, kept his level. After beating the Elite Four, the author appeared to have 3 options ahead of him. Capture Mewtwo with a Master Ball. Unfortunately, this just ended with Mewtwo killing his own allies, and then him and Mew fainting together. Option 2, a fight to the death, which did work, as after beating him, Mewtwo disappeared, and the game returned to normal. The final option was, what if he didn't attack Mewtwo? So instead of fighting, he focused on defensive moves. Eventually, Mewtwo will start questioning himself before killing himself. The story ends with the author waxing philosophical about whether Mewtwo was really a monster. Putting a dark twist on a classic is nothing new in the world of entertainment, and that's what the author experiences when his friends suggest he plays a ROM of a Pacm machine that was locked away in an abandoned amusement park. Opening the link that his friend sent him, he was greeted by the story of said Pacm machine, about how people who beat the game suffered severe psychological trauma, and occasionally physiological trauma, up to including the death of the player. Starting up the ROM, he noticed that the audio was heavily distorted, and that the insert coin briefly switched to insert soul. When he loaded into the first stage, he noted that the pellets weren't visible, until he got within a certain range of them, and that the normal blue ghost face was replaced with a jack-o'-lantern's face. The level did have power pellets, like a normal level, that allowed him to see the ghost, but unlike the normal version's pellets, he couldn't eat the ghost, he just died on contact. After finishing the level, he came to discover that the other levels were similarly changed. Level 2 was called Screamy, which had a ghost that upon seeing you, made a static noise and chased you. Level 3 is called Slender, where a ghost functions like Slender and disappears and reappears. The 4th level had a ghost called the Old One, who appeared to be a Cthulhu ghost. The 5th level was even further distorted, missing the traditional walls of a maze. Dying at this point would give you a jump scare, then a red game over screen that would flicker to please help. On level 6, things got more interesting, and while the walls have come back, there weren't any ghosts. Eventually another Pac-Man appeared. This one was a dark gray. Collecting more pellets, the words started distorting, changing from score to run, before the gray Pac-Man charged him, and when it caught him, the screen started glitching. When the screen cleared up, he was now in a first-person point of view. Around him he can see Pac-Pellets, then Pac-Man. He was a ghost now. Hitting Pac-Man 3 times, the screen went black and stayed that way. What could this mean? Were the ghosts past Pac-Man? Or maybe even worse, past players? The author was an amateur Wii hacker, getting into it after his friend showed him a tutorial on how to rip GameCube games from his Wii to the Dolphin emulator, which he was grateful for as his Wii's Player 1 port had been broken. Ripping Sonic Adventure 2, he began playing it. After playing for hours, the author decided he wanted to try to unlock all the hidden secrets, one of which was Maria's theme. After he unlocked the theme, something strange happened. Dolphin crashed. Reloading the game, the opening was now distorted, with Maria's character model tearing the graphics. Heading into the child garden, the author found a strange egg. Frustrated, the author decided to throw the egg at the wall. It cracked like normal, but the child that came out frightened him. It had Maria's hair on its head. The author decided to see if he could find anything else wrong with the game. So he started the dark story, and went to Shadow's past stage. The cutscene before the stage played like normal. That is until Maria's part came up, and the audio was messed up, with what she was saying not making much sense. Once the stage actually started, the objective, which is break through the besieging military, had all but a few letters grayed out. Maria was present throughout the stage. About halfway through the stage, the Gerald prison cutscene started, but it kinda just sat there, distorting the graphics. About halfway through the cutscene, images of Maria in, let's say, inappropriate positions for her age started showing. After beating this stage, the game skipped all the way to the White Jungle cutscene, except the dialogue didn't match the subtitles, which appeared to be broken up bits of a story. Using the screenshots, the author decodes what Maria seems to be trying to tell him, and uncovers the heinous acts of the scientist. The story ends with the author killing Gerald with Shadow and a black screen saying, "Thank you."
The author receives a message from a friend that is going to college in Europe soon, and really wants to do something before he goes. The friend really wanted to experience a game that he wasn't able to due to his family being really strict and religious. A weekend was decided upon, the game was selected. It would be Sonic 3 and Knuckles, the game that the friend wanted to play above all the others. With the weekend decided, all they had to do was wait. The week leading up to the gaming session wasn't great. The author's window was cracked by a crow, and the author's copy of Sonic 3 was thrown in the bathtub by her little brothers. This meant that she would have to go out and find another copy. After a whole morning of searching, she finally found a copy at a local game shop. She even had to trade in a coupon for a free coffee at her favorite coffee shop for it. Overall, $10 in the coupon wasn't that big of a deal, but it did eat up most of her day. The author hurries home, and as soon as she's through her door, she hears a knock. Without even a moment to sit down, she opens the door to her very excited friend. His excitement was immense as they settled in to play Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Starting the game up, the author noticed immediately that this wasn't the regular Sonic 3 and Knuckles. The way the game started was different, and Tails was nowhere to be found. This game had to be hacked. The author was so irritated as she really wanted her friend to have a true Sonic experience before he left, and now she had to explain to him that this wasn't the actual game. She decided not to tell him and continued with the game for now. Eventually they would find Knuckles, Tails, and for some reason Sally, but a blonde version of the character. As Sonic approached them, they backed away. Sally actually turned to look in the other direction. Eventually they got to a level that was made up of Sallys, a bunch of Sally bodies making up the terrain of the level. The bodies moved and looked painted with each action, and then the screen went black. Words appeared against the black screen. Here lies Princess Sally Anderson. Her Royal Majesty now sleeps in the most unconventional of graves. That was the breaking point for the friend, who turned to the author confused and shocked. She explained how the game was likely hacked, but wasn't sure what was going on either. She said they should stop playing, but her friend stopped her. He said no, he had to see how it ended. Sonic was now greeted by the character sprites of all the characters in the game, and even some like Amy that weren't originally in the game. They all stared at Sonic without a word. The author's friend moved Sonic towards the sprites and they watched him. All these sprites disappeared, and standing before him was the ghost of Sally. She watched him as the floor Sallies began to grab at Sonic's feet. They slowly pulled him down, drowning him in their massive bodies. The screen cut to black once more. Following that day, the author tried to forget about all of it, but also really wanted answers. She posted on a Sonic forum she used to frequent asking around. She also did some research into Sally Anderson. Someone on the forum post messaged her with a very aggressive wording. "You have my cartridges. You have my cartridges, and I want them back. Give me your address, and I can come pick them up." After receiving these messages, the author decided to continue her research into Sally Anderson, and found that she was a missing person in the area. The messages started sending rapid fire, but she wasn't going to respond to them. They kept coming and getting more aggressive. Many of the messages just continued the phrase of "give them back and give me your address." Finally, the author responded with, "Who is Sally Anderson?" It slowed the messages for a moment until she finally got a response. "Sally Anderson is mine." The author turned off the PC and unplugged the PC, but not before reporting the person and blocking them. She couldn't see any more of this. She was too disturbed by it all. A week later, the author decided to plug her PC back in. She found an email from an unnamed email. It detailed everything in her life, from the year she graduated high school to her car, license plate, and even what coffee shop she frequented. After she called the cops, she locked the door and grabbed the biggest knife she could find and went into her bedroom and locked the door, waiting for the police and hopefully not to end up like Sally Anderson.